Chapter 2081. Isn't that Efi, the owner of the Titan Tavern? The Titan wine was also a renowned wine back in the day. It's a pity that. Yeah, I used to go there often, but it's a pity that it's been lost forever. All that's left is her name. I see her every year, but the Titan wine she brews can't compare to her father's. However, her courage and perseverance are still very commendable. Some people recognized Efi, and whispered among themselves with a hint of pity in their voices. For some of the older wine lovers and tavern owners, the Titan Tavern had left a deep impression on them. 30 years ago, the Titan wine won the gold medal at the first wine tasting conference, and it was a legendary wine back then. Back then, the Titan Tavern was one of the most renowned taverns in Rodu. Unfortunately, the legendary brewer died in a robbery 15 years ago, and only left behind a daughter who wasn't even 15 years old. The Titan wine had been lost ever since. Even though the Titan Tavern reopened 5 years later, the Titan wine that Efi reintroduced was completely incomparable to the real Titan wine, and it was a huge disappointment to many wine lovers. Of course, there were also some regular customers who would visit the Titan Tavern from time to time as they took care of the daughter of an old friend. Efi greeted a few regular customers before taking a seat with a smile on her face. Meg took a glance at Efi, and was able to better understand her difficulties. Making a living was only one part of it. Bearing the expectations of the outside world and the glory of her father was the true source of her pressure. But what kind of tavern is the Saipan Tavern? I don't think I've heard of it before. Yeah, it sounds like a newly opened tavern. Otherwise, I would definitely know about it. That's because you don't know much about them. They're a new rising star in our Rodu, and not many people know about them yet. However, I've heard that their wine is quite good, and even Duke Abraham often visits them. There's such a thing? I've only heard about it. He must have brought wine with him. We'll know when the wine is served. Everyone's conversation turned to Meg, who was sitting beside Efi, and they began to pay more attention to him. The large church that could hold thousands of people was quickly filled to the brim, and there were even many people standing in the back row. Baron Kurt has arrived. Someone yelled. Everyone stood up. A white-haired but hale and hearty old man walked in from the door. Behind him were several other old men of similar age. The one in the middle is Baron Kurt. He's the vice president of the Wine Association and one of the founders of the Wine Tasting Conference. The one with the beard next to him is Fergus, the president of the Wine Association. He's a fair and professional elder? Eiffel introduced the elders to Meg. The Wine Association was a relatively independent organization, and these elders with their own statuses ensured that the Wine Tasting Conference was relatively fair and just. As the venue provider, Kurt represented the wine conference and gave a short speech to this year's wine conference. Let's cut to the chase. I know you don't want to hear me ramble on. I just want to know if any new wines have appeared in Rodu during the past year. Kurt smiled, and said, "That's right, I also want to know. Then, let's officially start tasting the wine. I can't wait any longer." Everyone below the stage smiled knowingly. This Baron was indeed an interesting person. At the very front of the church was a platform that was more than a meter tall. 5 tables were arranged in a row, and the 5 judges were seated. Each of them had a large glass filled with warm water in their hands. The wine tasting conference, as the name implied, was to taste the wines and rate them. Then, the winner would be decided based on the scores. As for the grading criteria, each judge would use a 10-point system based on the subjective feelings of the 5 wine masters. It didn't sound strict enough, but as long as the 5 wine masters were professional and fair, this was actually a relatively fair and effective method. There were more than 300 taverns participating in this year's wine tasting conference. Because of the large number of taverns, they were divided into groups of 5 by drawing lots. In order to reduce other factors affecting the winemaker's judgment of the wines, each group of wines wasn't introduced before they were brought to the stage. They were only revealed after the grading. A staff member came out with a wine bottle and 5 small empty wine glasses. He opened the bottle on the spot, then poured the wine into the glasses in front of everyone and brought them to the 5 judges. The faint aroma of the wine wafted through the air. Meg closed his eyes and sniffed. It was a typical sweet fruit wine. The aroma was passable, and there was nothing special about it. It was only slightly better than the homebrewed wines of ordinary families. The judges lifted their glasses and sniffed. Some shook their heads, some nodded, but their expressions were calm. Then, they each took a small sip and put down the wine cup in their hands. The taste of this wine is passable. It's a bit sweet, but there's still room for improvement. Kurt gave a brief review, then picked up the scoreboard in front of him. Kurt gave a score of 6, Fergus gave a score of 7, and the other 3 judges also gave scores between 5 and 7. First group, first bottle, Kalu's wine from Kalu's Tavern. Score, 31. The host quickly introduced. 50 points, a barely passable score. Meg nodded slightly. He had some recognition of the judge's professionalism. Not far away, a fatty looked quite happy. Although it was only an ordinary score, it was a few points higher than last year's. Moreover, it was the first wine on stage this year, so it would definitely be remembered by more people. The other 4 bottles of wine in the first group all scored between 30 and 40 points. Each time, a judge would give a brief review, which could also be considered as a suggestion. The judges tasted the wine in small sips. After tasting it, they would rinse their mouths with warm water and occasionally eat some pastries to fill their stomachs. Although there was a lot of wine, their speed was not slow. "Father, when will it be our turn to drink? And, when can we eat?" Amy looked at Meg and asked softly. This kind of occasion was really too boring for the little guy. He could not help but swallow his saliva a few times while looking at the pastries on stage. F looked at Amy and said with a smile, "Why don't Xiao Ai and Xiaoan go play outside for a while? Mara is outside. Let her take you to eat something delicious." Okay. Amy's eyes lit up, and she immediately nodded her little head. Meg turned to look at Irina. "Let's go." Irina nodded. His mind could completely cover the manor, so there would be no accidents if he let the 2 children go out for a party. And held Amy's little hand and quietly slipped out of the church. Fergus put down his glass and commented with a smile, "This is Kalu's Tavern's explosive wine. The taste is still as explosive as its name, and it brings a pleasant surprise as soon as it enters the mouth. It leaves a deep impression. Moreover, the taste of this year's wine has improved a little. It becomes smoother after entering the throat. It's quite a pleasant surprise." Kurt also nodded with a smile. Yes, it's a wine that people can't pretend not to know. Compared to previous years, it has indeed improved a lot. The judges showed their scores one after another. Group 32, third bottle, explosive wine from Kalu's Tavern. Score, 48. The highest score so far. The host's voice could not help but raise a few octaves. Chapter 2082. 48 points. That's close to full marks. So strong. Is Reese Tavern's explosive wine going to win the gold medal this year? There was an uproar below the stage. In the previous 30 groups, there weren't many wines that could reach 40 points, and those that could reach 45 points were even rarer. The explosive wine was only 2 points away from full marks. Based on past experiences, it had a very high chance of winning the gold medal. Reese Tavern was very famous in Rodu. It was one of the top high-end taverns in Rodu. Although it hadn't won the gold medal, many of its wines had won the silver medal in the wine tasting conference. The explosive wine was Reese Tavern's signature wine. Using the explosive wine to compete in this wine tasting conference again and getting the recognition of all the judges showed the ambition of Reese Tavern's owner. Everyone's gaze subconsciously turned to the middle-aged man sitting in the front row. He was wearing a luxurious golden robe, and his hair was neat and shiny. "Congratulations, Mr. Boris. Looks like there's hope for the gold medal this year." The people beside him had already started to congratulate him. The middle-aged man who looked quite respectable smiled and cupped his hands. He didn't appear to be too excited. The taste of the wine can only be considered above average. Looks like this wine has something special about its taste. Meg thought in his heart. 48 points was indeed a high score. At least from the previous scores, these 4 judges were professional and strict. The owner of Reese Tavern is very impressive. He has many taverns under his name, and each tavern has many main wines. It's said that he has recruited many impressive winemakers, and has been working hard to develop better wines, Eiffel introduced as she looked at that man with admiration. Meg nodded, and also took a few more glances at Boris. People who dared to invest time and money in innovation were all worthy of respect. It was because of their existence that an industry could continue to develop. And a tavern having more good wines to choose from was also a very strong core competitiveness. This might be the reason why Reese Tavern was still one of the top taverns in Rodu even though it didn't have any gold medal wines. After the explosive wine received a high score, a few other wines received a high score of 45 points. Most of them were wines that had won the gold medal, but according to the rules of the wine tasting conference, if the gold medal wines of the past didn't have obvious improvements and optimizations, an additional 3 points would be deducted. This law is very intelligent. Meg couldn't help but praise after hearing F's explanation. This was a rule that could constantly encourage outstanding winemakers to improve and innovate. It was also a rule that gave more opportunities to young winemakers. The Wine Association is an organization led by wine lovers. In essence, it's a consumer association, F said with a smile. Won't they get drunk? Irina, who had been silent all this while, asked the judges on the stage. It was already the 45th group. Although the wine tasting was done in small cups and sips, with more than 200 different types of wine mixed together, even if one only took a small sip of each wine, it was still not something an ordinary person could withstand. The judge's alcohol tolerance is quite good. Under normal circumstances, there shouldn't be a problem. Even if a judge is drunk, there are still a few reserved judges who can go on stage to ensure that the wine tasting conference can continue normally. Aife explained with a smile. His alcohol tolerance is indeed astonishing. Meg nodded. His alcohol tolerance was not bad, but he wasn't confident that he could remain sober after drinking more than 200 types of wine. However, after drinking more than 200 types of wine in a row and having to give comments, the 5 judges were more or less mentally exhausted. They didn't seem to be as active as they were at the beginning. Next is Group 50, the host announced. Soon, a staff member brought up a slender black wine bottle. It's the Titan wine. F's body unconsciously straightened. Her gaze was fixed on the bottle of wine held by the staff member. Meg's face also showed some interest. With the quality of the Titan wine and 30 years of cellar fermentation, it was naturally easy for it to beat the so-called explosive wine. The audience below the stage was also a little tired. The few wines that they were looking forward to before the wine tasting conference were already out. The suspense had already disappeared. This year's wine tasting conference's gold medal was most likely going to be taken away by the explosive wine. The staff member showed the crowd that the seal on the wine bottle was still intact. Then, in front of everyone, he pulled out the wine cork and poured it into the wine cups one by one. The rich aroma of the wine instantly wafted through the air. That was the elegant combination of the aroma of grapes and the aroma of aged wood. It made the originally dull venue come alive instantly. This wine aroma. Baron Kurt stood up immediately. He looked at the wine cup that the staff member brought over with disbelief. The golden wine swayed slightly in the crystal cup. It was as dazzling as a gemstone. Isn't this the Titan wine? It's brewed by Marcus himself. Fergus also stood up with a look of disbelief. Kurt and Fergus's performance and words caused quite a commotion. The Titan wine was the gold medal wine of the first wine tasting conference more than 30 years ago. It was created by the brewer Marcus. With its unique aroma and incredible strength, it left a legendary figure in Rodu's wine world. However, after Marcus died in a robbery 15 years ago, the authentic Titan wine stopped being produced. Although the Titan Tavern was still open for business, the Titan wine brewed by his daughter, F, was far from the authentic Titan wine. It gradually became a third-rate tavern. All these years, the Titan Tavern had participated in the wine tasting conference almost every day. However, they never scored more than 30 minutes. They didn't even reach the passing mark. They didn't expect that the Titan wine that the Titan Tavern brought out today would be able to outshine the previous wines just by its aroma alone. It also made the judges and the customers unable to remain calm. As expected of the first gold medal wine. I'm already a little tipsy just by smelling the aroma. It's not just the first gold medal wine. The Titan wine won the gold medal 3 times in 10 years back then. It's the real legend that kept improving. The Titan wine back then was the best wine in Rodu. I can't forget that taste even after more than 10 years. I didn't expect to be able to smell its aroma here today. Yeah. It's a pity that a genius brewer like Marcus died so young. F's eyes glistened with tears as she listened to everyone's words. It turned out that even after so many years, there were still people who remembered her father and the original taste of the Titan wine. Cups of wine were delivered to the 5 judges one after another. They all had complicated expressions. Kurt and Fergus were the organizers of the wine tasting conference back then. They were the ones who participated in awarding the first gold medal to Marcus. They also witnessed Marcus' research and improvement of the Titan wine, which led to the legend of 3 gold medals in 10 years. They didn't expect that 15 years later, a Titan wine brewed by Marcus would be brought to them again. Miss Effie, I respect and love Master Marcus very much. He is a genius winemaker, and more importantly, a persistent and firm winemaker. Even after 15 years, the legend of him and the Titan wine is still engraved in our hearts. Kurt stood and looked at F, who was sitting below the stage, with a complicated expression. Thank you very much for letting us feel his unparalleled charm again. However, according to the rules of the wine tasting conference, exclusive treasured wines can't be used in the competition. This means that customers won't be able to purchase them in your tavern. Chapter 2083. Regretful, that was the label that many people had for Master Marcus. He had left too suddenly and in too much of a hurry. He didn't even have time to choose a suitable candidate to pass down the brewing techniques of Titan wine. As a result, this fine wine that could have been passed down for thousands of years became a regret in everyone's hearts. Back then, the rare bulk Titan wine in Rodu had been sold at sky-high prices, but it was still very difficult to get a hold of it. Smelling the aroma of authentic Titan wine here today indeed made many old drinkers sigh and reminisce. However, just as Kurt had said, this bottle of wine that Effie had brought out was most likely a single bottle of wine that she had left behind. It was against the rules to use such wine in the wine tasting competition. This was because the purpose of the wine tasting competition was to evaluate and filter the various types of fine wine that could be purchased in Rodu. The most important prerequisite was that there was sufficient quantity and that it could be purchased. Everyone looked at Effie, who had stood up, with some looking at her with pity, while others looked at her with mockery. Even the owner of the Reese Tavern, who had received a high score earlier, couldn't help but turn to look at Effie. "Thank you, Master Kurt, for your affirmation of my father, and thank everyone for still remembering my father." Effie first bowed slightly to Kurt to express her gratitude, then stood up straight, and said in a loud voice, "This is not a single bottle of wine. It is a wine cellar that my father had sealed away 30 years ago. The cellar can only be opened after 30 years. I opened the cellar a few days ago, and this is the first bottle of Titan wine to be filled. Next, the Titan Tavern will re-release the Titan wine brewed by my father. The daily supply should be around 50 bottles." The crowd fell silent for a moment, then erupted into an uproar. A Titan wine that has been in the cellar for 30 years can be supplied 50 bottles a day. Master Marcus actually hid so much good wine back then. Looks like the Titan Tavern is going to be a good place to visit in the future. Although Master Marcus has left, his legend is going to start all over again. The drinkers present were all very excited, especially those who couldn't forget about the Titan wine. They had already started to make plans to gather at the Titan Tavern the next day. The tavern owners all had different expressions. If what Effie said was true, then the Titan wine would be a strong competitor for the gold medal. Many people's gazes wandered between Boris and Eiffel. In the past, Marcus had also suppressed Boris Tavern to win the gold medal twice, and was hailed as Boris's lifelong rival. He didn't expect that after so many years, Marcus' daughter would attack again with Titan wine, and her opponent would still be Boris's explosive wine. Boris's expression didn't change. He nodded slightly at Eiffel and then turned around. Marcus actually left behind so much hidden wine. Kurt was also surprised, but he quickly nodded and said, "If that's the case, this bottle of wine can participate in this year's wine tasting conference. Thank you." Eiffel nodded and sat back down, waiting for the judges to give their scores. The host said in a loud voice, "Okay, everyone, please keep quiet. Next, the judges will start tasting the wine. Let us look forward to the evaluation of this bottle of Titan wine that has been in the cellar for 30 years. The audience quickly quieted down. Everyone looked expectantly at the judges on the stage. Kurt picked up the wine cup and brought it close to his nose. He gently fanned the cup with his hand and took a deep breath of the wine fragrance. The rich and mellow fragrance was intoxicating. The fragrance of the grapes fermented in the oak barrel produced a special fragrance. It was so unique and so elegant that it made the previous wine pale in comparison. He took a sip and the wine slowly slid into his mouth. The taste was cold and dry, the wine's taste was soft, and the wine's fragrance lingered in his mouth. It was rich and charming, elegant and mellow. He seemed to be looking at an elegant goddess, a goddess that made people adore, yet didn't dare to approach. After a long time, Kurt opened his eyes and looked at the wine cup in his hand with admiration, saying, 30 years in the cellar has made the wine's fragrance and taste even more wonderful. It's like it's been sublimated. Whether it's the taste or the taste, it's even more enchanting than the Titan wine of the past." The 30 years in the cellar was probably the last time Kurt made improvements to the Titan wine, making it one step further. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to see this change with his own eyes. Fergus had just put down his wine cup and said with a rueful expression, "I thought the Titan wine of the past was already at its peak. Only today did I know that it was only a half-finished product." The cellar allowed the fragrance of the oak barrel to perfectly blend with the wine's fragrance, giving the Titan wine a brand new flavor. "This is the most unique and delicious wine I've ever tasted. This is Marcus' work from 30 years ago. At that time, we were also stunned by his Titan wine, and then 30 years later, we were stunned by him again. This is indeed an amazing wine. It's even better than the Titan wine of the past." Time became Marcus' best assistant, helping him finish the rest of the work and creating this true Titan wine. Another judge also exclaimed in admiration. The 5 judges all gave extremely high evaluations. There was silence below the stage. Everyone was waiting for the judges to give the Titan wine a high score. Ev also clenched his fists and nervously waited for the results to come out. Kurt picked up the number plate in front of him and said loudly, "I give 10 points. Unfortunately, I can only give 10 points. I also give 10 points. The Titan wine and Marcus are worth it." Fergus picked up the number plate. The other 3 judges also picked up the number plate and gave a perfect score of 10 points. 50 points. It seems that the wine tasting conference hasn't had a perfect score for 3 years, right? After 16 years, the Titan wine is going to win the gold medal for the 4th time. The scene suddenly burst into an uproar. A perfect score of 50 points was tantamount to announcing that the Titan wine had won the gold medal again. And the Titan wine had already won this honor 3 times. Ev finally couldn't hold back her tears. She bit her lips and tried hard to control her expression. "Congratulations. I believe that your father will feel gratified when he hears this news." Meg looked at her and said softly, thank you, Mr. Hades." Ev wiped her tears and quickly stabilized her emotions. Then, she smiled and responded to the congratulations of the people around her. The Titan wine returned with a perfect score of 50 points, just like Marcus' legendary life. After the scene quieted down a little, Kurt looked at Ev and said, "Miss Ev, I wonder if I have the honor of buying this bottle of Titan wine? I believe that this is a very memorable bottle of wine. It is also a bottle of wine that is worth carefully tasting. When my father was alive, he often said that you were an elder that he admired and respected. Please allow me to give this bottle of wine to you." Ev said with a smile. "Then I won't be polite. I will often come to the Titan Tavern in the future." Kurt got up and took away the wine and cork from the staff's tray. After closing the cork, he put it next to his hand. "You are really quick. How about we have dinner together tonight?" Fergus looked at the wine on the table and said with a smile, "Sure. I have a few bottles of good wine that I can take out to drink, but this bottle is not one of them." Kurt nodded with a smile. Chapter 2084. The Titan wine brought by AI Faye pushed the wine tasting conference to its climax. A bottle of wine brewed 30 years ago had crossed the river of time and once again shone brightly at the wine tasting conference. A perfect score meant that there was no suspense about the gold medal wine of the wine tasting conference. No one thought that there would be a wine that could be compared to the Titan wine in the remaining 10 groups of wine. That was what the 5 judges thought as well. But AI Faye didn't think so. She knew how unique Moutai was and how talented Meg was as a winemaker. She even thought that if there were 2 wines with perfect scores at the wine tasting conference, who would be the only gold medal? Such a situation had never happened in the 30 years of the wine tasting conference. Group after group of wines were sent to the stage. Perhaps it was because the Titan wine was too amazing that the judges were still in a daze, or perhaps it was because the quality of the following wines was too worrying, but none of the 4 groups of wines lasted more than 30 minutes. Kurt yawned and rubbed his eyes. He turned his head and whispered to Fergus, "I feel like I'm not in the right state. This group is finished. Let Gerald take my place." "That's good. You drank a lot today." Fergus nodded. "Group 55, begin the wine tasting." The host's voice was a bit hoarse. Meg yawned. He was also a bit sleepy. He turned his head and his eyes fell on the round wine bottle in the hands of the staff. His eyes lit up and he was suddenly energized. He had waited all morning for his Moutai to come on stage. He didn't think that his luck would be so bad and he would be ranked at the bottom. "It's here." AI Faye was also suddenly energized. Her expression became nervous again. Although she knew that Moutai was a good wine that was hard to find, she still hoped that it could get a good ranking at the wine tasting conference. The staff carried a round wine bottle to the stage. Everyone just glanced at it and lost interest. Most of the strong taverns had been evaluated. The explosion wine was the strongest, but it still couldn't beat the Titan wine. The staff studied it for a while and removed the red cloth wrapped around the bottle cap. Then, he pulled the cork out. Pop! A rich wine aroma quickly gushed out and quickly spread in all directions. This wine aroma. The people sitting near the high platform smelled the fragrance first and raised their heads in surprise. The eyes of the judges, who were tired and a little drunk, lit up one after another. They looked at the round wine bottle in the staff's hand in astonishment. The rich wine aroma was even more impactful than the Titan wine from before. If the aroma of the Titan wine was that of an elegant lady, then this aroma was more like an irresistible hurricane. Compared to the fragrance of grapes, her fragrance was even more mellow and deep. When he savored it carefully, he was actually unable to distinguish exactly how many fragrances she had, and he only became more and more immersed in it. What wine is this? How can the wine be so fragrant? Kurt, who was about to step down, suddenly raised his head and looked at the staff member who was pouring wine with a surprised expression. "Just by smelling the aroma, I can tell it's good wine. It seems like this year's wine tasting conference will have a new wine. Fergus' eyes also lit up as he spoke to Kurt with a smile. This was definitely the first time this wine had appeared at the wine tasting conference. Otherwise, with their experience, it was impossible for them not to recognize it. They were just curious about which tavern this wine came from and which master's new work was it. As the aroma of the wine spread out, there was also some commotion below the stage. Even the audience sitting in the last row of the church couldn't help but stretch their necks to look. This was the first time they had smelled the aroma of wine today. Those present were either tavern owners or wine lovers for many years. They were all experts. Once the aroma of the wine was released, they could naturally distinguish between good and bad. There were even people who had already begun to inquire about whose wine this was, guessing whether it could rival the Titan wine. Meg sat quietly and didn't say a word. An indifferent smile hung at the corner of his mouth, and he was already prepared to show off. The staff member began to pour the wine. The pure and transparent wine was poured into the crystal cups, which were as translucent as pearls. Cup after cup of wine was placed in front of the judges. The 5 judges all looked at the wine in front of them as if they had received a treasure. Fruit wine and grain wine were usually dark in color, which was very difficult to avoid during the brewing process. Such a pure and transparent wine was extremely rare. In contrast to the clear color of the wine, there was a rich aroma. It was hard to imagine that this liquid, which was as clear and transparent as a mountain spring, could emit such an alluring aroma. In terms of aroma alone, none of the more than 200 wines tasted today could be compared to this. This should be grain wine. It was brewed using the same method as the Titan wine. The aroma of the wine is rich, the aroma of the sauce, the aroma of the cellar, and a faint mellow sweetness are mixed together. The aroma is extremely unique. Kurt commented while fanning the aroma of the wine with his hand, then took a sip of the wine. Kurt closed his eyes. His brows furrowed at first, then slowly relaxed. The corner of his mouth rose slightly, revealing a satisfied smile. His slightly open mouth showed his relaxed state. After a long time, Kurt opened his eyes and couldn't help but exclaim, "This wine is soft, refreshing, and rich." After drinking it, the aftertaste lingers. It's truly a rare wine that's hard to come by in 100 years. As a true wine lover, whether it was the establishment of the Wine Association or the Wine Tasting Conference, he wanted to discover more fine wines and better winemakers. However, in the past few decades, there weren't many wines that could amaze him. Marcus Titan wine was one, and the wine he tasted today was the second. However, the Titan wine that Marcus brought to the scene 30 years ago couldn't be compared to this wine. The 30 years of cellar storage gave it a unique soul, giving it the qualifications to compete with this wine. This was a very perfect wine, or rather, it was a wine that exceeded the upper limit of what he could give advice on. Other than praising the wine and being curious as to who had secretly brewed such a fine wine, he had nothing else to say. Fergus raised his head and drank all the wine in his cup. He smacked his lips and put down the cup, still somewhat unsatisfied. He nodded and said to Kurt, "Everyone has smelled the aroma of the wine. Kurt has also mentioned the aroma of the wine. I can only say that this is one of the best wines I have ever tasted in my life, and it can even be ranked in the top 3. Now I'm very curious as to who could brew such a fine wine and keep it so mysterious." Kurt and Fergus gave an extremely high evaluation, and even promoted this wine to a historical status. Everyone was curiously guessing which tavern had presented this wine. Perhaps it could really compete with the Titan wine. "Congratulations, Mr. Hades' Moutai is indeed extraordinary." Eiffel turned to look at Meg and said with a sincere smile, "What I am more curious about now is, can there be 2 gold medals at the wine tasting conference?" Meg frowned slightly. Chapter 2085. Meg wasn't worried at all about the Moutai getting good reviews. But according to the rules of the wine tasting conference, there was only 1 gold medal wine. The Titan wine had already gotten 50 points. No matter how strong the Moutai was, there was still a limit. If that was the case, the situation became a little awkward. "This," Aife muttered. There hadn't been a double gold medal situation in the history of the wine tasting conference. "Judges, you have all given very high reviews for this wine. Now, let's ask the judges to grade this wine. Then, we can reveal the wine that brought everyone a surprise, which tavern it came from, and which winemaker it was made by." The host regained control of the chaotic scene. "Follow my heart's choice." Kurt picked up the scorecard in front of him and gave 10 points. Fergus picked up the 10-point card and raised his glass at the same time. He smiled and said, "I rarely use the word perfect to evaluate a wine, but this is indeed an impeccable wine. Smell this glass, it's still fragrant. It's really amazing." The other 3 judges also gave the highest score of 10 points. The scene instantly boiled over. Today, the second 50 points had appeared. In a wine tasting conference, there were actually 2 full 50 points wines. This had never happened in the history of the wine tasting conference. The Titan wine was quite famous, and it had once created the miracle of 3 gold medals. But where did this mysterious wine come from? It was as if it had suddenly appeared and then created a miracle in the wine tasting conference. Which tavern developed this in secret? Boris is so calm. Could it be that Boris Tavern secretly developed it? I don't think so. This isn't a wine that an opportunistic businessman like Boris can come up with. 250 points. How will this year's gold medal be distributed? Everyone was discussing enthusiastically. At the same time, they were all curiously guessing the origin of this wine. I'm so bored. I'm going to find the children first. Irina said to Meg and got up to leave the noisy church. Madam doesn't seem to be very happy. Ai looked at Irina's back and said doubtfully. Perhaps she didn't know what the honor of winning a gold medal meant to a tavern. It was something worth celebrating. And for a winemaker, this honor was a great recognition. But Irina didn't give her husband any encouragement or congratulations. It's just a small scene. She usually doesn't care, Meg said with a smile. Actually, he wasn't very excited either. If he couldn't conquer the drunkards in the alternate world with the wine master's trump card, then it would be too embarrassing. The host's Mount I Wine, Saipan Tavern? The scene fell silent. Everyone was puzzled. The name of this tavern sounded very unfamiliar. It wasn't one of the famous taverns in Rodu. A boss at the side looked around, and his gaze landed on Mag. When he saw the name of the tavern pasted on the back of his chair, his eyes lit up, and he exclaimed, "It's him." They recalled that this man had almost been mistaken for a baron due to the fact that he was surrounded by so many beauties. No one would have thought that this young and promising man with so many beauties in his arms was the owner of the wine that had received a perfect score of 50 points. Furthermore, the owners of the 2 wines that had received perfect scores of 50 points were sitting together. Meg stood up with a smile and nodded as he sensed everyone's gaze on him. That's right, it was the aura of a leader. Young man, did you brew this wine? Kurt was a little surprised to see how young Meg was. That's right, Meg nodded. Good, good, good. You're young and promising. Kurt nodded as he looked at Meg with approval in his eyes. He then looked at Ai, who was sitting beside him, and sighed with emotion. Marcus was around your age when he came here with the Titan wine, and he also made a name for himself. Ai looked up at Mag, and it was as if light had shone down on him. She could see some of her father's silver on him, and tears began to well up in her eyes again. Thank you. Meg nodded before sitting down again. The Mount I wine score of 50 points was even more shocking to everyone than the Symbian wine. At the same time, it also piqued everyone's curiosity. How were the organizers going to decide who would win the gold medal? Nice to meet you, I am the owner of the Kesha Tavern, my Dishuan, the portly owner next door said to Meg with a smile. Nice to meet you. Meg nodded in a reserved manner. Congratulations on the success of your Mount I wine, boss. However, forgive me for my ignorance, but I still don't know where the Symbian Tavern is located. I'd like to try it myself in a few days. My Dishuan wasn't discouraged. All of the surrounding tavern owners also perked up their ears. From today onward, the Symbian Tavern was destined to become one of the most popular taverns in Rodu. Everyone was curious about this unknown tavern. Where exactly was it opened? Why did it have such good wine and why was it unknown before? You're too kind, boss my Dishuan. Our tavern has only just opened, so it's normal that you don't know about it. The tavern is located on Romo Street, and it's open at night. If you have time, you can come and have a seat. Meg quickly switched to professional mode for interested customers. Romo Street. My Dishuan thought for a moment before his eyes suddenly widened. He glanced at Ai with a hint of surprise, then turned to Meg, and said, Then isn't it on the same street as the Titan Tavern? That's right, Boss Hades' Tavern is right across from ours, Ai replied with a smile. Ai's words shocked everyone. 2 taverns on the same street had both received 50 points in the wine tasting conference. The Titan Tavern was destined to return to the top with the return of the Titan Tavern. Meanwhile, the Mount I wine was already able to compete with the Titan Tavern after receiving such praise and a perfect score. It was destined to become one of the most popular taverns in Rodu. Everyone could already imagine how popular this street was going to be in the future. If I remember correctly, Romo Street is really lonely now. Most of the shops on both sides of the street have closed down, and the rest are barely hanging on. Back in the day, the Titan Tavern was able to bring Romo Street to prominence. Now, with the addition of the Symbian Tavern, it's only a matter of time before Romo Street returns to its former glory. Why don't we set up a shop on Romo Street and open a tavern as well? Big Brother is eating the meat, so maybe we can get some soup. After all, high-end wines are all limited in quantity. That's a good idea. Let's go check it out later. Chapter 2086. First, it was the Titan wine, then it was the Moutai wine. These two divine wines were released one after another, pushing this wine-tasting conference to the climax and making the other wines play a supporting role. All 60 groups of wines had been selected, and the scores had been announced. What made everyone curious was who the Wine Association would award the only gold award to. The Titan wine and Moutai wine had both received full marks. The 5 judges on stage discussed with the other 5 judges, and tasted the 2 wines on the spot before finally reaching an agreement. Fergus walked up the stage again and gestured for everyone to be quiet. The venue quickly quieted down, and everyone looked expectantly at this esteemed president. He was going to announce the final winners of this wine-tasting conference. Fergus looked at everyone, and said in a loud voice, "This wine-tasting conference has brought us a huge surprise, but also a huge challenge. There is an endless stream of fine wines, and the hard work and breakthroughs of the winemakers in the past year have been a pleasant surprise. However, the fine wines also made our selection more difficult and complicated. For example, the Titan wine that has been in the cellar for 30 years and the Moutai wine that stunned everyone on its debut. To choose a better wine between the two as the gold award is like asking us which is more important, our wife or our mother. It's simply making things difficult for all the judges." Everyone smiled knowingly. The president was still so humorous and witty. Fergus raised his voice again, and said, "So, after careful consideration, we have finally decided to make an exception for this wine-tasting conference. The Titan wine and Moutai wine will both receive the gold award." The venue was silent for a while, and soon, there was an uproar. Double gold award. This had never happened before in a wine-tasting conference. The tavern owners looked at Meg and Effie enviously. This was equivalent to getting a guaranteed performance for the next year. The Titan Tavern had regained its glory, and the newly opened Saipan Tavern would soon become one of the busiest taverns in Rodu. Congratulations to the Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern. Now, let's invite the 2 tavern owners to come up to receive the gold award, the host said. That's great. There's actually another gold award. Effie was so surprised that she almost jumped up. She's quite flexible. Meg also nodded with a smile. Meg and Effie stood up and walked up the stage. The 2 of them were around 30 years old and looked to be in the prime of their lives. Everyone below the stage envied them. Fergus and Kurt each held a large golden wine cup with the words Wine Conference Gold Medal engraved on it. "I hope you can inherit Marcus' mantle and continue to pass on the Titan wine." Kurt gave the trophy to Eiffel and encouraged. Fei held the trophy with both hands and nodded seriously. "Thank you, I will do my best. Young and promising, the younger generation will surpass us in time." Fergus handed the trophy over to Meg and smiled. "I've brought out next year's trophy as an emergency. I hope to see you bring even better Moutai next year." The audience burst into laughter. "No, Moutai is the best." Meg shook his head. Everyone looked at Meg in surprise. Were all the youngsters nowadays so arrogant? Fergus also looked at Meg. "But if I come again next year, I'll definitely bring other wines. I might have to prepare another trophy." Meg raised the trophy in his hand and looked at the sparkling colors. "My girl should like it very much." Fergus and the people below the stage all laughed. "Young man, you're very interesting. You're to my liking." Fergus reached out and patted Meg on the shoulder. "Then I look forward to what kind of surprise you can bring us next year." Meg and Effie stepped down and returned to their seats. After the gold award came the silver award. The explosive wine and 4 other wines from Reese Tavern won the silver award of this wine conference. No one had expected that the explosive wine, which was regarded as the most likely to win the gold award, would be beaten by the Titan wine and Moutai wine in succession. The high score of 48 points seemed somewhat overshadowed. After the announcement of the bronze award wine, the highlight of this wine conference came to a perfect end. "Congratulations." "Same to you." Meg and Effie left the church together with a knowing smile. Meg was very gratified. The Titan wine regained the gold award and would add a fire to his real estate speculation business that would continue to burn. Meanwhile, Effie was looking at Meg with admiration and gratitude in her eyes. If it wasn't for Meg tearing off the seal of the wine cellar and letting her use the Titan wine in the competition, she wouldn't have been able to stand on the podium and receive the trophy that belonged to her father. And Meg himself received the gold award trophy very calmly, as if he had expected it. Meg and the others came out of the church and saw Amy and Anne sitting on the swing in front of the church with a pile of delicious food in their hands. Irina stood not far away and Mara was guarding the two children. "Miss, we won the gold award." Mara looked at the trophy in Effie's hands and ran over with her eyes shining. Her face was full of surprise. "Yes, our Titan wine won the gold award." Effie nodded with a smile. That's great, that's great." Mara carefully stroked the gold award trophy, tears already falling down her face. Meg took the trophy to the swing. "Wow, Father, is this made of gold?" Amy put the plate in her hands on the swing and jumped down. She looked at the trophy in Meg's hands and asked with shining eyes. "It should be." Meg smiled and handed the trophy to Amy, who had already wiped her hands. "I'll know once I try it." Amy opened her mouth and bit the trophy, leaving 2 neat rows of teeth marks on the rim. "Yes, it's soft. It's real." Amy nodded with experience. "It seems that participating in this competition has some value." Irina took the trophy and flicked her fingers. The wine glass made a pleasant sound. "Double gold award. Our neighbor also won a gold award. It seems that the price of the house I invested in is going to increase," Meg said with a smile. "She's quite popular," Irina said with a smile. Mag turned around to take a look. Effie was talking to a middle-aged man who was wearing a golden robe. He had an impression of that man. It was Boris, the owner of Boris Tavern. If it wasn't for the Titan wine and Moutai wine that came out of nowhere, the gold award wine of this wine tasting conference would have been their wine. The lean and capable Boris looked quite elegant, a typical eligible bachelor. However, he didn't look like he was flirting with Effie, but more like he was discussing something. Meg had no intention of interfering with Effie's life. He looked at Irina with a smile and asked, "The main event of the wine tasting conference is over. There will be a banquet in a while. Should we go back or eat at home? What do the children think?" Irina looked at Amy and Anne. "We just got to the kitchen. There's a kind fat uncle there. He's already given us all their delicious food." Amy stuffed a fried meatball into her mouth and shook her head. "So we can eat at home." Chapter 2087. Meg respected the children's choice very much, so he held the golden trophy and left the manor with his family. He was about to hail a carriage by the roadside to go home. After waiting for a while, Meg finally saw a passing carriage. He stopped it and carried Amy into the carriage before letting Anne and Irina into the carriage. "Hello, Mr. Hades. Can I have a moment of your time?" Meg was about to get into the carriage when he was stopped. Meg retracted his leg and turned to look at the person who came. He knew the person who came. It was Mr. Boris, who had combed his hair into an adult style. "May I know what's the matter?" Meg asked him. "I am Boris. Congratulations on your Moutai wine winning the gold medal at the wine tasting conference." Boris smiled and extended his hand to Meg. "Thank you." Meg gave him a handshake before retracting his hand. "Congratulations to you for winning the silver award for your explosive wine." Boris's mouth twitched. If he hadn't met Meg and Effie, his explosive wine would have won the gold medal. However, he showed great self-restraint and quickly smiled. "Mr. Hades is a genius winemaker like Master Marcus. Our wine naturally can't be compared to yours." "You flatter me. Is there anything else, Mr. Boris? If not, we will go home first." Meg couldn't be bothered to stand in the cold wind and flatter him. His wife and children were waiting in the carriage. "Wouldn't it be nice to go home and sit warm?" Boris looked at Meg with a sincere expression, and said, "Mr. Hades, you're a very straightforward person. I actually want to invite you to become my business partner. I have 10 large taverns in Rodu, and Mr. Mag is an exceptional brewer. If we can work together, I'm sure we'll be able to create a legend in the wine industry." "Sorry, I am not very interested in creating a legend. If there is, then I am a legend." Meg smiled and stepped onto the carriage to signal the coachman to drive off. "Mr. Hades, you can think about it. If you have any ideas, you can find me at Reese's Tavern at any time," Boris said as he stood to the side and looked at the carriage. Meg didn't answer and let the coachman go to Romo Street. He could see that Mr. Boris was an excellent businessman, but he didn't need such a friend. Perhaps he had said the same thing to Effie before, but he didn't know if Effie had agreed to his proposal. That guy just now looked like a scheming person. He didn't seem like a good person, Irina said as she looked at Meg. "Businessmen pursue profit. There's no good or bad to speak of. I don't have any intention of becoming friends with him," Meg said with a smile. "What about you?" "I'm not a businessman. I'm a chef. Occasionally, I invest in some industries that are seriously undervalued," Meg said frankly. "Will the house prices on Romo Street really rise? They all said that you suffered a loss." Irina said in disbelief. If they could understand it, they would have been rich a long time ago. Meg smiled and said with confidence, "There's no need to wait until next year. There will be more people coming to ask about the shops tomorrow." The value of the commercial street was supported by popularity. The gradually declining Romo Street was a low-value area. With Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern winning the Double Gold Award, they would become the twin stars of Romo Street and bring a wave of popularity to Romo Street. With the increase in popularity, the commercial value of Romo Street naturally began to rise. And if other businesses wanted to take advantage of this popularity, they would launch business activities on Romo Street and drive the popularity to rise again. This was a story of mutual achievement. As long as the commercial system of Romo Street could be rebuilt and attract more powerful and unique businesses to move in, a brand new commercial system could be created. And the construction of this commercial system would be supervised by Meg. As the first landlord of Romo Street, he had more than 100 buildings in his hands. He already had this right. A commercial street was like a system. If it wanted to be healthy for a long time, it had to be planned. Homogenization and inferiority would destroy a business district, and it would be doomed to never go far. Meg naturally left such professional matters to the system. If something could be perfectly solved with 10 copper coins, there was no need to exhaust his brain cells and force out an unprofessional business plan. Back at the restaurant, Meg first made a sumptuous lunch. After lunch, he went out to find the young real estate agent who had sold the house to him. "Supervisor, there's a man outside who calls himself Hades looking for you." A staff member quickly walked into the office and said to Fitch, who was organizing information. "Hades?" Fitch raised his head and thought for a while. Suddenly, his eyes widened and showed some surprise. "Supervisor, is it someone unsuitable to meet?" The staff member saw that Fitch's expression wasn't too good and probed. "Should I let him go?" "Okay, just say I'm not here." Fitch nodded. "Okay." The staff member turned and walked out. "Wait." Fitch called out to the staff member who had walked to the door of the office and took a deep breath, saying, "Forget it, I'll go myself." "Okay." The staff member was a bit confused, but still nodded. Fitch put on his jacket and let out a long sigh before walking out. At the beginning of this month, Fitch, who had been a real estate agent for 3 years, finally welcomed a turning point in his work and became a supervisor. And what made him successful was that he had left a legend in the real estate world. He had sold more than 100 buildings on Romo Street in one go, dealing with the low-quality properties of more than 10 real estate agents in one go, becoming a legend. He had also been promoted and given a raise, becoming a supervisor, and even had his first date with the boss's daughter. And now, Mr. Hades, who had made him successful, had actually come knocking on his door. Could it be that he had come to his senses and realized that he had been scammed? Fitch was a bit flustered. Although he had handled the transfer of ownership of more than 100 buildings very cleanly, as Romo Street continued to decline, the value of the old buildings facing the street would only continue to decrease. "Mr. Hades, please come in and have a seat." Fitch walked out and saw Hades standing at the door. He hurriedly put on a smile and greeted him. "There's no need to go in and have a seat. I'm here today to ask if you accept intermediary services for renting out shops." Meg looked at Fitch and got straight to the point. This young man's work attitude wasn't bad, and his efficiency and business ability were passable. This was also why Meg had chosen him again. Fitch had thought that Meg was going to give him a good scolding, and he faltered slightly upon hearing this. He only came to his senses after a while, and turned to Meg with a surprised expression as he asked, "Mr. Hades, are you planning to rent out all of the shops that you purchased earlier?" "Yes, but I don't want to talk to those people myself, so I'd like to find a professional organization to do this work for me." Meg nodded. "I see." Fitch looked at Meg and couldn't help but feel a little guilty. Mr. Hades had been a respectable person back then, but he had bought so many trashy shops in one go. If Fitch had advised him back then, things wouldn't have turned out this way. Now that he wanted to rent out these shops to recoup some of his losses, it was understandable. However, it was rare to even see a shadow of a person on Romo Street now. Which idiot would spend the money to rent and open a shop? "Mr. Hades, I'm afraid that your shops, don't you have this service?" Meg interrupted his nonsense. "We have a rental intermediary service. If it's Mr. Hades, I can even give you a discount. I'll only take 5% of the annual rental fee as an intermediary fee." Fitch nodded. He really couldn't bear to see Meg's stubborn look. He could even feel the helplessness and regret. Chapter 2088. Meg used half an hour to convey to Fitch the system's design of the distribution and composition of Romo Street's businesses, as well as the shocking rental prices. Meg then took a look at all the recently listed buildings on Romo Street and bought another 30 or so buildings. Mr. Hades, you are truly a god. Fitch had mixed feelings as he watched Meg sign the contract so readily. Although he'd earned another few $100,000 in brokerage fees, he felt a sense of guilt as he watched Meg sink deeper and deeper into the abyss. As for the business plan Hades had mentioned earlier, it was a completely imaginative idea that was several times higher than the average rental price on Romo Street. Make a trip to Romo Street in the afternoon and leave your contact information on my vacant apartment. Someone should be looking for you soon. Meg said with a smile. All right, that's part of my job. I'll immediately bring someone over once I've sorted out the information. Fitch nodded with a smile. A straightforward customer like Hades was probably the favorite of every salesperson. Today's transaction volume for 33 buildings had exceeded his expectations for his first month as a supervisor. He wondered if he'd be able to have dinner with the boss's daughter tonight, or if he'd be able to take some other steps forward. Meg could tell what Fitch was thinking, but the other party's attitude was friendly and his business skills weren't bad either. He was worth cooperating with, and didn't care about anything else. Fitch saw Meg out the door and arranged for the store's carriage to take him home. Mag sat in the horse-drawn carriage and stretched his back comfortably. At such a young age, he was going to live a life of collecting rent every month and become the most handsome landlord on this street. The lives of the rich were just this dull and boring. Supervisor, you're truly a god. You've sold 33 buildings in one go. The employee who'd come in earlier looked at Fitch with admiration. It's a routine operation. Fitch placed the information in his hands on the table with an indifferent expression. Sort out this information and then come with me to Romo Street. All right. He picked up the documents on the table and asked curiously, why are you going to Romo Street? Didn't you sell all the houses there? The buyer asked us to help rent out these houses, so we're going to put up rental notices, Fitch said. Are there still people renting shops in that place? That person was a little confused, but he still took the information and returned to his seat. Not long after, Fitch led his subordinates down to Romo Street. The streets were still deserted, and there were only a few pedestrians. The scattered shops were also in a half-closed state, and many of them were pasted with transfer notices. I think it won't be long before there are no more shops on this street, the subordinate whispered as he glanced at the tavern next door. Fei Qi also sighed in his heart. Romo Street also had its glory days. However, he quickly withdrew his gaze and stuffed the glue bucket in his hand into his subordinate's hand. Take the money and do the work. Hurry up and put up the notice. We have to put it up on over 100 buildings this afternoon. Supervisor, what kind of family does that boss have? He bought over 100 buildings just like that. No matter how cheap it is, it's still 200 million copper coins. Is he really that rich? The subordinate couldn't help but ask curiously as he worked. If he says he's from an ordinary family, would you believe him? Fitch glanced at him. We can't say we don't believe him, right? The subordinate shrugged his shoulders. Then hurry up and put it up. The weather is so cold, isn't it comfortable to go back and warm up? Fitch rolled his eyes. He also carried the glue bucket in one hand and pasted the notice on the door with the other. Romo Street wasn't large, and most of the houses were old. However, these houses could all be demolished and rebuilt. This wasn't a difficult matter for construction teams with cultivators. It was even cheaper than renovating old buildings. However, Fitch didn't feel that there would be any idiot who would come here to rent a house and do a business that was clearly losing money. Unless, another Mr. Hades came. Excuse me, is this house for rent? A voice rang out from behind Fei Qi and the others. Fitch turned around and saw two well-dressed middle-aged men standing behind them. Yes sir, this building is for rent. It's not just this one, there are over 100 other buildings on this street that are available for rent. Fitch showed a professional smile and nodded. Over 100 buildings, they're all yours? The tall and thin middle-aged man on the left said with some surprise. No, we're just agents responsible for renting out the buildings for the owners. Fitch shook his head and sized up the two with a reserved gaze. Judging from their clothes, these two were rich and upper-class people. Could it be that he had really met a sucker again? Wasn't his luck a little too good? Agents, huh? The two came to a realization. How big is this building, and how much is the annual rent? The short and fat one asked. Fitch flipped through the information Meg gave him in the morning and quickly found the serial number of this building. He answered, this building has a single-floor area of 200 square meters, 3 floors above ground, and an underground cellar. The first year's rent is 200,000 copper coins. 200,000 copper coins? Isn't that a little too expensive with this location and the flow of people? The middle-aged man frowned, clearly dissatisfied with this price. This is the price that the owner requested. We have no right to change it. Fitch smiled wryly. He'd already mentioned this to Meg before, but he'd insisted on this price. But look at this building. It's a very new building on Romo Street, and the internal structure is still very intact. It used to be a tavern, so there are many things left that can be used directly. If it wasn't on Romo Street, the price would be much higher on any other street. Fitch promoted enthusiastically. If it wasn't on Romo Street, there wouldn't be such a cheap store. But it's also because of Romo Street that it shouldn't be priced like this. The tall and thin middle-aged man shook his head with a smile and pointed at the tavern with the sign for sale hanging not far away. Then the tavern's transfer fee plus 1 year's rent is only 200,000 copper coins. Wouldn't it be better to just take over and be able to operate? That would indeed be a better choice. Fitch nodded frankly. These two were clearly smart businessmen. The short and fat middle-aged man looked around and said to Fitch, "You're the middleman, then do you know if there are any stores for sale on Romo Street?" Stores? Fitch and his subordinates both looked surprised. It was already strange enough that these two smart businessmen wanted to rent stores on Romo Street, but now they were asking about stores for sale. Could they really be two idiots? However, all the buildings on Romo Street that were intended for sale had already been bought by Mr. Hades. The 33 buildings today were the last batch. The remaining buildings were basically for personal use or rent, and had no intention of being sold. My apologies, the last 33 buildings have already been bought today. There shouldn't be any stores for sale on Romo Street at the moment. Fitch shook his head. Chapter 2089. What? The two middle-aged men looked surprised. Were they all bought? All of them? The short and stout middle-aged man stared at Fitch. Yes. Fitch nodded, not understanding why the two had such a reaction. Alas, we're still too late. The tall and thin middle-aged man patted his thigh with a regretful expression. I didn't expect that someone would come earlier than us. We shouldn't have eaten that lunch. The short and stout middle-aged man was also regretful. Fitch and his men looked puzzled. They looked at each other and shook their heads. So, the one who commissioned you to rent out more than 100 buildings is the buyer, right? Can you tell us who he is? The tall and thin middle-aged man looked at Fitch and asked. Fitch shook his head and said apologetically, "Sorry, this is the customer's privacy. We can't disclose it." The two middle-aged men looked at each other and saw pity in each other's eyes. Fitch looked at the two and asked somewhat curiously, "I'm a little curious. Why are the two gentlemen suddenly so interested in the shops on Romo Street? After all, as you said, Romo Street isn't very popular." "Since there are no more shops to buy, I might as well tell you the truth. In today's wine-tasting conference, Romo Street's Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern both took home gold medals. Moreover, they were both gold medal wines with full marks." The short and stout middle-aged man said somewhat ruefully, "You can ignore the current Romo Street, but in the future, Romo Street will be beyond your reach." "What? Double gold medal?" Fitch and his men stared with wide eyes. As a qualified salesman, Fitch was very clear about the principle of a commercial street's popularity gathering. He hadn't seen the grand occasion of Romo Street, but he had heard his seniors mention it many times. Romo Street had quietly risen by relying on Titan Tavern's gold medal, and had been prosperous for more than a decade. It was precisely because Titan Tavern lost Marcus and was reduced to an ordinary tavern that Romo Street began to go downhill and finally became what it was today. But today, Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern both took home the gold medal of the wine-tasting conference. It could be imagined what kind of popularity these two taverns would bring to Romo Street. It wasn't impossible for Romo Street to return to its peak, or even create an even greater glory. And Saipan Tavern? Wasn't that Mr. Hades' tavern? Fitch gulped as he saw the same type of shock in the eyes of his subordinates. He suddenly thought of a terrible thing. From the beginning, when Mr. Hades took a fancy to Romo Street and bought more than 100 buildings in one go, he had already planned to use the Saipan Tavern as an anchor to restore Romo Street to its former glory. Today, the Saipan Tavern won the Gold Award, so he was ready to rent out the shop. He also set many restrictions, and the rent was much higher than the market price. This was not a rent that was much higher than the market price. It was a very reasonable rent. Moreover, Mr. Hades had bought the last 33 buildings, which meant that he controlled more than half of the high-quality shops on Romo Street. This street would be called Hades Street in the future, and probably no one would be able to vote against it. One could imagine the value of the 100-plus buildings in Mr. Hades's hands when Romo Street returned to its peak. Mr. Hades is truly a godly man. Fei Qi was incomparably shocked. While he was still feeling complacent about the 2 million intermediary fee, the other was already considering a business that was worth several hundred million. This was probably the difference in perspective. The two middle-aged men turned back to the tavern that was about to be sold. Fitch's words made them determined to buy the tavern today. Otherwise, when the news spread, it would be even more difficult to find such a low-price property. Supervisor, could all of this be part of Mr. Hades' plan? The subordinate gulped as he looked at Fei Qi and asked. If it was only the Titan Tavern that won the gold award, I might think it was luck. Fei Qi waved the proposal in his hand and smiled wryly, but the Saipan Tavern also won the gold award, and Mr. Hades even gave me such a complete proposal. This already explains everything. This time, he must have made a lot of money, right? The tavern street in the north of the city is now worth around 5 million. Fei Qi tried to make his expression not so sour. Hiss. The subordinate sucked in a breath of cold air and said sourly, then the owners who sold their houses today will probably cry themselves to death. Fei Qi smiled, there's nothing to say about this. Mr. Hades earned this money with his own ability. If it wasn't for him settling down in Romo Street, the commercial value of this street would have already hit rock bottom. He would have become the new founder of this street. That's true, truly admirable. The subordinate nodded in agreement. In their hearts, Meg had already risen from a sucker to a business magnate. Hurry up and put up the announcement. In the next month, just renting out these shops will be enough to fill up next month's sales. Fei Qi urged with a smile. Alrighty. The subordinate responded, full of enthusiasm. When they passed by the Saipan Tavern, the two stopped to look around for a while before leaving in amazement. The news that the Saipan Tavern and the Titan Tavern both won the Gold Award at the wine tasting conference also spread like wildfire on Romo Street. The owners who stayed behind on Romo Street didn't believe it at first, but after confirming it, many of them cried tears of joy. The glory of Romo Street back then was still vivid in their minds. Just when everyone was about to give up, this double gold award was like rain after a long drought, and instantly gave the owners who were about to give up a shot in the arm. Back then, the Titan Tavern alone propped up the entire street. Now, there was another Saipan Tavern. Everyone could see the future of Romo Street. The waiter ran into the tavern, and whispered a few words into the tavern owner's ear. The owner was discussing the transfer of the tavern with two middle-aged men, and was struggling over the final price of 1 or 200 copper coins. The tavern owner was shocked, and asked the waiter, really? The waiter nodded with certainty, and said, that's what everyone is saying. It has already spread throughout Rodu, so it can't be fake. The two middle-aged men looked at each other, and both cursed in their hearts. Let's go with the price you said. Let's sign the contract, the short and fat middle-aged man urged. The tavern owner shook his head with a smile, and said, wait, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to transfer this tavern. The tall and thin middle-aged man furrowed his brows, and said, we've already discussed to this extent. Isn't it a little inappropriate for you to back out now? Those two owners are hiding the news and trying to take over my tavern at a low price. Isn't it a little inappropriate? The tavern owner's smile faded, and he chuckled coldly as he said, I didn't attend the wine tasting conference today, so I don't know about the Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern, but you can't take me for a fool. Forget it, forget it. Let's go look for other shops. The short and fat middle-aged man sighed, and got up to walk out of the tavern. The tall and thin middle-aged man could only get up and leave. After the two of them left, the tavern owner said to the waiter, quick! Go and take down the sign outside, and then contact a renovation team to close the tavern for 3 days and renovate it. So sudden? The waiter was a little stunned. The tavern owner, who was still having a headache over the transfer of the tavern, was now rejecting the transfer request, and even wanted to renovate the tavern. Nonsense, if it's too late, we'll have made a lot of money. The tavern owner pushed the waiter out of the tavern and took down the sign on the door. He didn't forget to remind the waiter, go and find the construction team today, and we'll start work tonight. The earlier it's finished, the better. You can even pay more. Oh, okay. The waiter left with a stomach full of confusion. The same situation was happening everywhere on Romo Street. The shops that originally had the sign for transfer all took down the sign one after another. And those dilapidated and dirty shops started to clean up one after another, or directly chose to close their doors and renovate. These shops that had gathered because of the Titan Tavern were indeed a little outdated. The lack of popularity led to a lack of motivation to renovate. Now, taking advantage of the popularity of the Double Gold Award, the owners also had the idea of upgrading their shops. Miss, now everyone knows that we won the Gold Award, and many people have come to congratulate us. Mara excitedly ran into the winery and said to F, who was seriously operating the machine in front of her. F closed the machine and looked at Mara. Don't run around if you have nothing to do. Go outside and keep an eye on the construction team. Our renovation and expansion must be done well. The Titan Tavern in the future will be different from before. Oh. Mara nodded and turned to walk out a few steps. Then she turned back and looked at F with confusion. But miss, why didn't you accept Mr. Boris's invitation? This way, not only can you have many taverns, but you can also call them Titan Tavern. You don't have to work hard to make wine every day, and you can sleep in every day. Your little head only knows how to sleep every day, and you don't know anything else. F unhappily tapped her forehead. Looking at the winery, she smiled and said, I don't want so many taverns, I only want this one that my father and mother left for me. Also, I like to make wine, and I want to truly inherit my father's business and make authentic Titan wine. This is what will make me happy. Oh. Mara nodded as if she didn't understand. Go, get to work. F waved her hand and chased Mara out of the winery. When Boris talked to her today, he did indeed give her a very sincere offer. She would become a partner of the Boris Tavern, 30% of the shares, and earn tens of millions of dividends a year. Furthermore, she would be able to retain full ownership of the Titan Tavern. However, he also gave her a condition that she couldn't accept, and that was to share the cellar and brewing method of the Titan wine. Hence, F rejected Boris's offer of partnership, even though he said that he was good friends with her father. Now, she only wanted to manage the Titan Tavern well and make it one of the best taverns in Rodu, just like it used to be. The cellar could only supply about 50 bottles of Titan wine a day, so she had to brew more Titan wine and sell it according to the year to attract more customers. She didn't want to just rely on her father's savings. Meg also received many congratulations from his neighbors, and he also expressed his thanks in a friendly manner. Neighbors should take care of each other. As for the renovation plans of these bosses, he was very supportive. One of the main reasons why Romo Street lost its competitiveness was that the businesses on the entire street looked too old and outdated. Customers liked the new and hated the old. Apart from those old shops that focused on taste as their core competitiveness, people preferred shops that looked new, even if it was only the shop's renovation that looked new. Father, these neighbors are so nice. The table in front of Amy was filled with all kinds of food, all of which were given by the neighbors who came to congratulate them. Everyone knew that the tavern owner had a pair of cute daughters, so they mostly gave some snacks and small toys. Yes, it's rare to see such passionate neighbors nowadays. Meg nodded with a smile. Saipan Tavern had won a gold medal, and these neighbors were the true stakeholders, so this kind of enthusiasm was understandable. What made him happier was that after the wine tasting conference in the morning, the popularity of the Titan Tavern had successfully exceeded 1,000, reaching 2,122. And this number was still steadily rising. With the strength of word of mouth and the endorsement of the wine tasting conference, even the customers who didn't taste the Saipan Tavern personally became fans of the Saipan Tavern. I was right to attend this wine tasting conference. Meg nodded with satisfaction. Ding! Congratulations to the host for completing the stage mission. The restaurant's popularity has exceeded 1,000. Received reward, a spicy field snail recipe. The system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. Sucking screws? Meg raised his eyebrows slightly. This was probably a challenge for the people of the other world. This kind of skill, even many foodies in China didn't master it, and could only rely on external help like toothpicks. And a man who could suck screws was said to have a higher level of spouse rights. Of course, Meg didn't understand these words, and it was only hearsay. Spicy field snail was a traditional dish that went with wine, and as a reward, it was a small surprise. Meg was very good at sucking field snails, and was also very popular with girls. This was true. Because Saipan Tavern's Moutai won the gold medal of the wine tasting conference, Meg gave himself a day off to celebrate. A notice was hung at the door, and Meg glanced at the Titan Tavern that was being renovated overnight. When the drunkards who heard the news saw this scene, they would probably cry. Amy, and we're going out for a while, and we'll be back later. Stay at home and play on the second floor. Don't go out, okay? Meg locked the door from the inside, and looked at Amy and Anne, who were holding a gift bag of snacks that had just been extracted from the wishing well. Are you going to beat up the bad guy? Amy asked. Yes, we're going to maintain world peace. Meg smiled and nodded. Amy's eyes lit up, and she looked at him expectantly. Can you bring me along? I'm also very good at fighting. Meg patted her little head and said, Not this time, that bad guy is very dangerous. When Amy grows up and becomes stronger, you can go. Okay. Amy nodded obediently and didn't insist. Remember, no matter who comes, don't open the door. The door is locked from the inside, and no one can come in. Meg reminded again, and watched the two children go upstairs before stepping into the teleportation portal with Irina. The tavern had a level 9 defense strengthened by the system, and Irina had set up a defensive formation. As long as it wasn't attacked by many level 10 powerhouses, it would be able to hold out until they returned. Meg just received a letter from Melanti, saying that they found an abnormal location in the north, and asked him to go check it out. Meg naturally didn't dare to delay since it was related to the Great Old One. And Irina took the initiative to ask to go together. Chapter 2090. To the north of the Roth Empire, there was an endless snowfield. This place was covered in snow all year round, and there was almost no sign of life when one went deeper into the snowfield. No one knew how far north it was because the further north one went, the lower the temperature would be. Furthermore, there would be blizzards and storms. Even 10th tier giant dragons wouldn't be able to pass through those obstacles. There were even cases of 10th tier giant dragons getting lost in the snowfield. Because of that, this snowfield had become a forbidden area that all the races wouldn't set foot in. At this moment, Noah was waving a piece of red cloth to guide the purple-striped griffin in the sky to land at a fault in an ice cliff that was more than 250 kilometers deep into the school. "Mr. Mac, did you bring food?" Noah asked shamelessly when the griffin had just landed. Meg looked at Noah, whose nose was red from the cold, and whose eyebrows were covered in frost. He smiled and took out a ball of mud and a small cup that was still steaming. "Wow, Buddha jumps over the wall and beggars chicken." Noah's eyes widened as he swallowed his saliva. After staying in this snowfield for a few days, he had been eating frozen pancakes that had to be roasted over fire to bite into. He still felt the bone-chilling cold when he slept beside the fire at night. It was a life worse than death. When he suddenly saw the steaming Buddha jumps over the wall and the beggar's chicken, Noah was about to cry when he opened the lid. "Mr. Mac, you are my second parent?" Noah said to Meg with tears in his eyes as he took a bite of the beggar's chicken. No. I don't have a son like you. Amy will despise you." Meg quickly rejected him as he looked at the cave entrance on the ice cliff. "Mr. Mac, you are here?" Melander walked out of the cave quickly. "Yes. What's the situation here?" Melander suddenly called him to this place, but it didn't look conspicuous. "Follow me in. I will tell you as we walk." Melander led Meg and Irina into the cave. "Grandpa, aren't you going to eat some beggar's chicken and Buddha jumps over the wall before working?" Noah's voice sounded from behind. "Go ahead, I'm not hungry." Then, he said to Meg and the others, "We discovered this ice cave this morning. The tortoiseshell stone reacted, and we only found this cave after searching for a long time." "Josh has been here before?" Meg frowned. "I'm not sure yet, but this ice cave is very strange. You'll know when you get in." Melanti didn't say much, but he quickened his pace. After passing through a long ice path, the road ahead suddenly opened up. A huge ice cave appeared in their line of sight, and their position was in the middle of the ice cave. Meg's eyes lit up. He didn't expect there to be another world under the ice. "Look below." Melanti walked to the edge of the ice cliff and pointed down. Mag and Irina poked their heads out to take a look, and their expressions changed. Below the ice cave was a huge ice surface. On the ice surface, there were countless human-shaped and beast-shaped holes. It was as if someone had dug out something from the ice. Some broken bones and body parts were scattered in the holes. There were signs that they had been eaten recently. A strange aura shrouded the ice cave. "This is..." Meg frowned and felt a chill on his back. Melanti pondered and said, "I once read an ancient book. It said that in ancient times, the snowy plains in the north were an ancient battlefield. Many races fought here and left many corpses. These corpses were buried in ice and snow. Many of them were perfectly preserved because they were frozen. People have been finding ancient corpses on the snowy plains. There are many mysterious ancient corpses whose races cannot be identified. If I'm not wrong, this should be an ancient battlefield. There are many ancient corpses buried here." "What about the ancient corpses?" Meg suddenly felt uneasy. "The ancient corpses have disappeared. Judging from the traces, it happened not too long ago," Melanti said with a serious expression. "They should have been controlled. There are remnants of demonic aura." "It has something to do with demons," Irina said. She raised her hand and shot out a beam of golden holy light. It reacted violently with the remnants of black demonic aura on the stone wall. Meg was silent for a while. He looked at Melanti, and said, "In other words, Josh could have controlled the ancient corpses here and turned them into servants that he could order around." "Yes. If it was just to absorb resentment, there wouldn't be these holes and gnawed corpses left." Melanti nodded. "I'm very familiar with the method of controlling corpses. However, he used a more advanced method. It's similar to bewitchment. But they have been dead for countless years. All that's left are corpses that have been slowed down by the ice and snow. How can he bewitch them? Meg was puzzled. As long as the resentment doesn't dissipate, he can do it. That's why demons are so scary. Melanti shook his head slightly, and frankly said, even us ghosts can do it through some methods. Irina retracted her hand, and coldly said, instead of absorbing resentment, he chose to control these corpses. What is Josh trying to do? When the various races of the Norland continent put aside their differences and decided to join forces to deal with the demons, what he needed was sufficient strength and numbers of helpers. Meg looked at the densely packed corpses below with a complicated expression, and said, these corpses will form a powerful undead army that will follow him to conquer the Norland continent. If that's the case, I'm afraid there are many more ice caves like this in the northern snowfield. Countless ancient corpses that died in battle are buried under this snowfield, Melanti said in a low voice. Save me. Grandpa, there's a ghost. Right at this moment, a shrill voice sounded from the cave. Noah was running over with the Buddha jumps over the wall in his arms and a drumstick in his mouth. Dense footsteps sounded behind him. At the same time, the ice walls in all directions of the ice cave suddenly exploded. Ancient corpses jumped out from the ice walls and pounced on Meg and the rest. Countless ancient corpses also crawled out from underground, and roared as they climbed up the ice walls. There were thousands of them. Most of these ancient corpses had strange appearances. There were three-headed humanoid beasts, human-faced spiders, giants with only half a head left, monsters with green fur all over their bodies. Their bodies were incomplete, and they did not belong to the races that existed now. The similarity was that their eyes were glowing with a faint red light, and they were rushing toward Meg and the rest in a frenzy. Seems like this is a trap. He knew we were coming from the start. Meg pointed his finger forward, and the Tian-Du sword turned into an afterimage as it shot into the eerie tunnel, killing all the ancient corpses that were rushing toward them. We have to leave from here. The terrain is not in our favor. Irina raised her magic caster's staff, and the light from her staff shone, and the ancient corpses that were pouncing toward her were instantly turned into ashes. However, these ancient corpses seemed to be endless. After a batch was destroyed by the holy light, they continued to surge out from underground and the walls, and almost covered the entire wall of the cave. A teleportation talisman appeared in Irina's hand, and she lit it up on her fingertips. A golden light flashed under everyone's feet, but it was annihilated by a black demonic aura that suddenly appeared. Chapter 2091. The teleportation spell failed, and the four of them were left where they were. It's an anti-magic array formation. It seems like he prepared a lot in order to keep us here. Irina frowned and raised her hand to conjure up a magic barrier, blocking the attacks of the ancient corpses outside the barrier. Follow me. Let's leave this place first. Meg pressed the SOS button in his pocket, and the longsword flew back into his hand. He rushed toward the cave that they came from. Countless ancient corpses swarmed in from outside the cave, but they were no match for the Tian-Du sword. They forced their way through. Melander protected Noah, who was hugging the Buddha jumps over the wall, and followed behind Meg to deal with the ancient corpses that suddenly appeared from the cliff. Irina brought up the rear with her law enforcer's staff. The holy light was like a divine weapon in the narrow tunnel. It swept through everything without any pressure. However, Meg and the rest had only rushed halfway when the cave started to shake violently and then collapsed. Pass from above. Mag shouted in a deep voice. He and his sword became one as they spun upward. The 10,000-year black ice turned into ice chips like tofu under the Tian-Du sword. A tunnel that was about the width of a person was forced open. Not long after, light shone through the ice. Bam! A huge hole appeared in the ice field. Meg broke out of the ice with the Tian-Du sword in his hand. However, before Meg could heave a sigh of relief, a black shadow rushed toward him. Meg instinctively raised his sword and slashed out. Ding! The sound of metal clashing against stone was ear-piercing. Meg only felt as if he was hit by a speeding train. His body flew backward uncontrollably. He twisted in midair, and his longsword stabbed into the ice. However, he still flew backward for about 100 meters before he could stabilize himself. The black figure had already charged towards him once again. The black spear was suffused with a dim light, and the black armor was new. The resolute face was expressionless, and the gaze was somewhat stupefied as it suffused with a dim red light. Meg stood up with his sword. He looked at that familiar face with a complicated expression. The disappeared Rankster. Meg didn't expect to meet him here. Rankster appeared in front of him in an instant and engaged him in close combat. Meg, who was on guard, was no longer in such a sorry state. However, he still retreated a dozen meters. Rankster was also sent flying by the sword. His spear stabbed into the ground, and he stopped after retreating a dozen meters. So powerful! Noah exclaimed. Melander and Irina were also shocked. There was no doubt that Meg's strength had exceeded the limits of level 10. Although he was not a god, level 10 could not be compared to him. Rankster, on the other hand, was able to fight on par with Meg and not be at a disadvantage in the battle. It was evident how strong he was. Bang! 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 At the same time, the ice surface shattered, and ancient corpses crawled out one after another. They were densely packed, as if they had covered the entire snowfield. Once again, they rushed towards Melander and the others. Meg blew a long whistle. Roar! Ozzy flew over from the distance and spat out a ball of lightning. It swept through the ancient corpses and flew towards Irina and the others. Rankster stared at the purple-striped griffin. He raised his spear and aimed it at Ozzy. "Your opponent is me," Meg shouted. With a wave of his hand, the Tian-Du sword had already turned into a stream of light and flew towards Rankster, piercing straight towards his heart. Rankster retracted his gaze instantly. He retracted his spear and swept it towards the Tian-Du sword that was flying towards him. The sword was sent flying, but Meg caught it and rushed towards Rankster again. The two of them were already fighting in close quarters. "Get up!" Irina tossed Noah onto the purple-striped griffin before jumping onto the griffin's back with Melanti. The purple-striped griffin quickly rose into the air and narrowly avoided the half-headed giant's stone axe. At the same time, it spat out a string of lightning balls, blasting the giant into pieces. "Why are there so many of these darn things?" Noah's voice trembled as he looked at the densely packed ancient corpses on the snowfield. Even sitting on the griffin's back, he could not see the end of them. There were probably more than 100,000 of them. "I'm afraid Josh has already met up with the devils that escaped from the seal," Irina said with a frown. "Once these ancient corpses head south, the Norland continent will face a terrifying catastrophe." Melander's voice was also trembling. "Let's get rid of the surrounding ancient corpses first to reduce the pressure on him." Irina quickly retracted her gaze. She chanted a magic spell and used the holy light technique to sweep away the ancient corpses that were trying to get close to Meg. Melander grabbed a handful of black beans from his waist pocket and scattered them down. After they landed, they turned into black ghost-faced swordsmen and charged towards the ancient corpses fearlessly. Noah hugged the Buddha jumps over the wall and became a useless person who was shouting 666 the whole time. The peak close combat between Meg and Rankster was already not something they could participate in or control. There was no fancy sword aura, nor was there any battle aura. The battle between the two of them had already returned to the essence of a battle. It was a battle between a peak swordsman and a peak gunner. Every blow was filled with killing intent. Their surroundings looked calm, but there were countless spatial rifts that had been cut open. The ancient corpses that barged in were directly cut into pieces. Back then, when Alex was at the peak of his power, he met the only opponent who could match him, Rankster. Meg didn't expect to meet Rankster again after he broke through the 10th tier shackles. He was still evenly matched with him. It was just that this top powerhouse had already lost his mind, and became a valiant general under the control of the Great Old Ones. Meg's emotions were more or less a little complicated. There was the sigh of appreciation for each other, and also the pity for Elizabeth. She had been looking for Rankster all this time, following in his footsteps, but to no avail. He wondered how she would feel if she saw Rankster's current state. "Rankster! Rankster!" Meg shouted at Rankster, and tried to communicate with him. Rankster's red eyes seemed to flicker slightly, but he quickly fell into an even more frenzied state, and launched an even more intense attack on Meg. Meg's eyes lit up. Rankster seemed to still have a little consciousness, and wasn't completely under his control. He continued to call out to him as he blocked Rankster's attacks. However, other than making him even crazier, there wasn't any obvious effect. "Rankster! Elizabeth has been looking for you all this time. Do you want her to see you like this?" Meg shouted. Rankster's forward movement paused, and a struggling expression appeared on his face. His eyes also switched between blue and red. "It's effective." Meg's face lit up, and he continued, "For Elizabeth. For the Frost Dragon tribe. You must wake up. You are Rankster, the king of the Frost Dragon tribe, Elizabeth's father. You are not the devil." Shot. Rankster muttered a few words with a pained expression. Then, he fell into a frenzied state again, and attacked Meg. Meg looked at the red-eyed Rankster, and used the corner of his eye to look at the sky as he blocked the attacks. He obviously couldn't wake Rankster up, but the Ancient Ones might have a way. He could only hope that she could see his distress signal and come as soon as possible. "What is that?" Noah, who was sitting on the griffin, pointed to the north and exclaimed before she arrived. The ice started to tremble violently, and a gelatinous thing that was as big as a hill and covered in scales slowly crawled out from under the ice. It raised its huge bat wings and covered the sky. Chapter 2092. A huge, indescribable object rose slowly from the ice. The sky turned black, and countless dark clouds gathered. A terrifying aura spread, and even the purple-striped griffin was trembling slightly. Its gelatinous body, which was covered in black scales, kept changing its shape like a huge worm. Just one look at it was enough to make one feel terrified. After the huge bat wings were raised, it was at least a few thousand meters tall. Its huge body was still incomparably huge in this boundless snowfield. However, it didn't seem to have a head, and only had a huge body, which made it even more eerie. "It's Cthulhu," Melander said with a trembling voice. There was deep fear in his eyes. "Seems like this is the one that escaped from the Dragon Island?" Irina's expression also became very serious as she held a few disposable talismans in her hand. Cthulhu's power was undeniable. In the seal outside Chaos City, tens of 10th-tier powerhouses couldn't do anything to it even if they joined forces. Meanwhile, Meg, who could barely delay it, was being held back by Rankster, who was equally powerful. Without the seal as a shield, even if the three of them joined forces, they wouldn't be a match for this fellow. Cthulhu's appearance made the ancient corpses even crazier. Tens of ancient corpses that could fly rose into the air, and formed a formation as they flew towards Irina and the rest. Cthulhu let out a disgusting sound, and then wriggled towards Meg. Along the way, the glacier shattered. The struggle in Rankster's eyes had disappeared, and was replaced by a sea of red. His power seemed to have been strengthened, and he attacked Meg crazily. "You guys go first," Meg shouted at Irina and the rest as he retreated. Meg's heart was heavy. He didn't expect to meet Cthulhu when he was just investigating an ice cave. Or rather, this was a trap that Cthulhu had set for them to jump into. He was far from being a match for Cthulhu now. Even if he fought Rankster, he would only have a 50% chance of winning. The problem he had to consider now was how to escape and avoid being controlled by Cthulhu and becoming a puppet like Rankster. "Violet, go get him." Irina raised her magic caster's staff and chanted loudly, "O holy light, destroy all evil." Dazzling holy light swept out, and dozens of ancient flying corpses were instantly turned into ashes. The sky was cleared. Roar, the purple-striped griffin let out a long screech and spat out a ball of lightning from its mouth. Then, it flew towards Meg. At this moment, Cthulhu suddenly turned towards them and flapped its wings. Countless black whirlwinds appeared out of thin air, tearing through space and blocking the purple-striped griffin's path of advance. Moreover, the whirlwinds also began to surround it. Whoosh! The black whirlwind tore through the tough scales of the purple-striped griffin like a sharp blade. Just by touching it, it tore open a huge bloody wound on its body. The purple-striped griffin felt the pain and hurriedly pulled back, avoiding the black hurricane that had almost formed a wall. "Go around them," Irina ordered calmly as she cast healing magic on Ozzy. Ozzy turned into a purple lightning bolt and once again charged towards Meg from the side. However, it was still blocked by the hurricane and could not break through. "We have to leave immediately. When he really attacks us, we won't be able to leave," Melander said in a low voice as he used the phantom blade to kill a few ancient corpses that had appeared behind them. Noah hugged the Buddha jumps over the wall and was completely in a daze. He had become a salted fish that had even forgotten to shout 666. "No matter what, we have to bring him along." Irina looked at Cthulhu that was wriggling towards Meg and closed her eyes. Irina's body slowly rose and floated in the air. The golden red dot between her eyebrows began to glow, and a small golden tree pattern appeared in the red dot. It looked just like the tree of life. A light green beam of light flew down from the sky and landed on her forehead. Irina opened her eyes, and her aura began to rise. "Grandpa, why do I feel that she has become a little different?" Noah came back to his senses and looked at Irina, who was floating in the air in astonishment. "She's borrowing the power of God." Melander looked at Irina and was also surprised. "God of light, please grant me the power to eliminate this evil existence and cleanse all filth and sin." Irina raised the magic caster's staff in her hand. A crack suddenly appeared in the dark sky, and a golden light landed on Irina's body and illuminated her. Irina's aura rose again, and her entire body was enveloped by the golden holy light. She was like a deity that no one dared to look directly at. Cthulhu's huge body gradually stopped and then turned to face Irina. There were spots of red light on its body that were covered in scales, and they were staring at Irina like eyes. "Holy light, judge this evil. Let everything return to peace." Irina pointed her magic caster's staff at Cthulhu, and a huge ray of holy light gushed out and collided with Cthulhu. The collision between the black demonic aura and the holy light made a teeth-numbing sound of corrosion. Cthulhu's body was enveloped by the holy light, and it began to tremble slightly. "It's effective," Noah exclaimed in surprise. Melander did not appear too optimistic, and instead said to the purple-striped griffin, "We'd better back off and take this opportunity to go around the hurricane." The purple-striped griffin understood his words, and suddenly swooped down, almost sticking close to the ground as it found a gap in the hurricane, and rushed towards Meg. Kiki, Cthulhu made a sound like glass being broken. Black demonic aura suddenly surged out of its body and rolled out, extinguishing the holy light that was enveloping it. Its huge bat wings flapped slowly, and its huge body was lifted off the ground. Its body wriggled, and a black tentacle formed from its abdomen, and pierced towards Irina, who was suspended in mid-air. "Oh no!" Meg slashed Rankster away with his sword, and his expression changed drastically when he saw that tentacle piercing towards Irina. Under Rankster's entanglement, he was completely unable to block this attack for Irina at this moment. And Irina seemed to have used a power that did not belong to her to unleash that attack, and was still in that state. "Get lost." Meg's eyes were red as he sent Rankster flying with his sword, and then used all his strength to throw the Tian-Du sword out. Swoosh! The Tian-Du sword turned into a ray of light, and flew towards the tentacle that was piercing towards Irina like a spear. It was too late. Meg's heart had already dropped to the freezing point. Cthulhu's speed was faster than his, and he could not cut off the tentacle before it pierced Irina. The golden light in Irina's eyes gradually dissipated, and then she saw the tentacle that was already in front of her. Right at this moment, a silver light tore through space, and instantly pierced through the tip of that tentacle. At the same time, a gunshot pierced through the sky. Chapter 2093. Irina, who thought that she would not be able to escape death, was still in a daze when a light shield rose around her body and blocked the green liquid that splattered everywhere. "It's she?" Meg's eyes lit up. Seeing that Irina was safe and sound, his heavy heart was instantly relieved. With a wave of his hand, the longsword returned to his hand. In this world, it was his first time hearing such a beautiful gunshot. It was a precise and clean shot that perfectly matched the feeling that she gave him. A 5-star battleship appeared in the void. The giant rail gun at the front of the battleship was rapidly charging at Cthulhu. The 3 main cannons were also aimed at Cthulhu. "What is that?" Noah slowly stood up and looked at the giant steel battleship floating in the air in disbelief. "No matter what it is, the good news is that it is at least on our side," Melanti also swallowed and said softly. Boom! 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 The giant cannon began to roar. The giant cannonball pushed by the railgun crashed into Cthulhu that was floating in the air. Its mountain-like body was pushed back a lot before it exploded. The terrifying explosion wave turned all the ancient corpses within a few hundred meters into ashes. The purple-striped griffin had already turned around and flew out, but it was still pushed back 1,000 meters by the aftermath of the explosion. What terrifying power! This giant steel beast is actually so terrifying. Noah was in a daze. Meg also retreated with his sword. This was a concentrated bombardment from a star battleship of an advanced civilization. He did not want to be caught in the crossfire. In just a few seconds, a round of bombardment was completed. The mountain-like Cthulhu was blown 1,000 meters away. Its body was charred black and there were many holes on its bat wings. The ancient corpses within 1,000 meters were also turned into charred skeletons. Goo 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 goo, Cthulhu let out a series of incomprehensible roars at the giant battleship. It activated the ancient corpses to attack the giant battleship and Meg's group again. Tens of thousands of ancient corpses rushed over and almost piled up together. Cthulhu flapped its wings and soared into the sky. The holes on its wings were quickly mended, and in the blink of an eye, it was as good as new. It flew toward the battleship as well. "Come up. We can't kill him. Let's leave this place first." She's cold voice rang in Meg's ears. A passage was opened in the cabin. "Ozzy, go in through the tunnel." Meg jumped onto the purple-striped griffin that flew to his side. He then approached Irina, grabbed her waist, and plunged into the passageway of the 5-star warship. The fully charged arrowhead cannon fired another electromagnetic cannon at Cthulhu. At the same time, it dropped several cluster bombs. With the recoil of the electromagnetic cannon, it instantly pulled away from Cthulhu, tore through the void, and left this place. Meg heaved a sigh of relief as he watched the mushroom cloud rise from the ice field. He felt as if he had just survived a disaster. This is too scary. Noah slumped to the ground. His entire body was drenched in sweat as if he had collapsed. The rare thing was that he was still holding the Buddha jumps over the wall in his arms. The jar actually did not shatter. Melander was also panting heavily. Although he had seen countless deaths in his life, he did not want to die in the hands of Cthulhu. Even if it was his corpse, he did not want to fall into its hands. At this moment, he finally felt how ridiculous he was. He had actually been trying to find Cthulhu and kill it for hundreds of years. Irina came to Meg's side and reached out to hold his hand. She asked with concern, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. It's just a small injury." Meg shook his head and looked at the wound on his arm that was cut by Rankster's spear. "What is this?" Irina asked as she cast a healing spell on Meg. This was a spacious and empty room. The four walls were made of steel, and there was only transparent glass that faced the outside world. "She saved us," Meg said. Irina was deep in thought, and did not ask any more questions. Right at this moment, the door at the side opened, and a woman in white tights walked out of the operation cabin. Noah and Melante turned around and looked at her in surprise. Then, they fell unconscious. "I will erase their memories," she said to Meg before her gaze landed on Irina. "This is my wife, someone who should know about this and be able to keep it a secret," Meg introduced. "Thank you for saving me." Irina looked at she and thanked her. If she had not appeared earlier, Cthulhu's tentacles would have pierced her heart. She nodded slightly and withdrew her hand. "Cthulhu controls many ancient corpses. I'm afraid this ice field will become the source of its soldiers. These fearless and numerous ancient corpses will bring a terrible calamity to the Norland continent." Meg looked at she with a grave expression. "Perhaps the ancient ones have a way to kill it? Cthulhu is immortal. We can only try to reseal it. Even the ancient ones can't kill it." She shook his head. Meg's heart was heavy. She and the ancient one's most advanced battleship still could not kill Cthulhu. This was not good news. It would not be easy to reseal it. The ancient ones once swore that they would not enter the Norland continent on a large scale. You can only rely on yourselves to resist Cthulhu and the zombie horde it controls. She shook his head. "No way." Meg raised his brow. The strength of an ancient corpse could not be underestimated. It probably retained about 60% of its strength, and it was fearless under Cthulhu's control. It was an absolutely loyal death warrior. It was still unclear how many ancient corpses Cthulhu controlled. If it was a million-strong army, even the entire Roth Empire would not be able to stop them from going south. Stopping the ancient corpse army is the key, but killing or resealing Cthulhu is the root of the problem, Irina pondered. Moreover, we did not see Josh today, but today's arrangement seems to be his doing. She nodded. When Cthulhu was sealed back then, it was cut into two. Its head was sealed in the center of the seal, and its lower half was sealed under the Sky Island. Its head is better at spiritual control. These ancient corpses are not controlled by the lower half of its body. It is more likely that the recorded head is controlling that puppet, and then indirectly controlling it. If we miss it today, it will not be easy to find it in this vast ice field in the future. Meg frowned. "I left a location tracker on it. It can determine its location." She raised her hand to raise a virtual screen. A red dot was moving quickly. "But the problem now is not where it is, but how to reseal it and find the brain that really controls the ancient corpses." Meg looked at She's virtual screen and nodded. "As long as we can determine its location, the sealing spell formation can be solved, and we can also think of a way to reseal it. However, the most important thing now is to unite all the races of the Norland continent and quickly build an alliance to resist the zombies and stop the ancient corpses from going south. The advanced civilizations were ultimately unreliable. They could only rely on themselves to save the Norland continent. The 5-star warship stopped 250 kilometers away from Rodu. She used hypnosis to erase part of Noah and Melander's memories, and then let Meg and the rest leave. "Don't come over." Noah suddenly sat up from the griffin's back. His forehead was covered in cold sweat. He looked around and met the gaze of Meg, who was squatting in front of him. He then turned around abruptly and saw Melander, who was slowly waking up beside him. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief. What's going on?" Melante sat up and patted his dizzy head. Previously, they encountered Cthulhu on the ice field and were in a desperate situation. When they were about to be swallowed, he was suddenly attacked and fainted. After that, he could not remember anything. "We were lucky to escape." Meg threw 2 water bottles to them, "but we were not very lucky. Cthulhu controlled the ancient corpses on the ice field, and his strength increased tremendously. He might invade the south at any time. We have to build an alliance to stop him before he makes his move." Noah tilted his head back and drank half a bottle of water. He looked at his hand, and then looked around. He was a little lost. "Did my Buddha jumps over the wall drop?" Chapter 2094. Noah was very sad. He had carried the Buddha jumps over the wall through the ice cave, fought the ancient corpses, and had a close relationship with him. Yet, he had sacrificed himself in the battle. However, the good news was that Mr. Mac had promised to compensate him with Buddha jumps over the wall when they returned. There was probably nothing more blissful than being able to leave this cold snowfield and return to the big city full of pretty ladies. He could even eat a hot meal of delicious food. Meg brought Noah and Melander back to Rodu, and settled them in the same house as before. Naturally, he didn't have time to make Buddha jumps over the wall for them. He could only reward them with 2 packets of instant noodles. Instant noodles? This name sounds a little evil? Noah squatted by the table and observed the food in the mysterious package carefully. Do you know how to cook? Melander asked as he took a puff from a pipe for himself and glanced at him. Mr. Mac said that you don't need to know how to cook to eat instant noodles. You just need to boil the water and pour everything in the package into the bowl. Then, add boiling water and wait for a while. Noah agreed, and started to cook. 5 minutes later, the father and son each held a bowl, raised their heads and drank up the noodle soup. They even licked the bowl unsatisfactorily. I didn't know that my culinary skills were so amazing. It was indeed a waste of talent in the past. Noah put down the bowl with a look of amazement. If you had such skills in the past, we wouldn't have to starve in the wild. Melander reached out and gave them chestnuts. Noah nodded with an aggrieved expression. Grandpa, this is also a newly discovered talent of mine. There will be plenty of opportunities to show it later. Melander picked up the pipe again and smoked. But, Grandpa, what should we do next? We can't beat that Cthulhu, Noah asked as he cleared the bowls and chopsticks. In the past, he was full of confidence and wanted to find the devil with his grandpa. Now that he knew how scary the devil was, he had lost all his fighting spirit. They weren't on the same level at all. Even if that devil stayed there and didn't retaliate, he wouldn't be able to kill it. Mr. Mac went to find an alliance between the various races. We ghosts can also do our part. Melander put down the pipe. When the nest is overturned, no egg can remain intact. If Cthulhu controls the Norland continent, it will be completely over. Meg made 10 copies of the photostones, and sent them to the various powers through Chaos City's channels. After that, he and Irina headed straight for the Rodu Royal Palace. The purple-striped griffin hovered outside the palace and let out a long cry. The auras of over 20 powerful beings were immediately released from the Imperial Palace, and countless powerful beings were converging toward this location from all over Rodu. Several layers of defensive formations rose up, heavily protecting the Imperial Palace and the several main halls. In the blink of an eye, the Imperial Palace had entered a state of battle readiness. Above the Imperial City, several auras locked onto Meg and Irina. Alex and Irina's sudden appearance outside the Imperial Palace in the middle of the night came as quite a shock to all of the powerful beings in Rodu. Alex, why have you come to visit so late at night? A vigorous voice sounded from the top of the city gate tower. Meg looked at the armored general on the city gate tower, and loudly said, Marshal Dominic, I have something important to discuss with King Andre. It has to do with the safety of the Norland continent. Please pass on my message to him. All right, wait here. I'll get someone to report to His Majesty, Dominic replied, and instructed his subordinates to do so. Over 100 9th tier and 10th tier powerhouses arrived one after another, and took up positions outside the palace. They were also staring at the purple-striped griffin and the 2 legendary figures on the griffin with restraint and vigilance. Both parties faced off in silence just like that. The Rodu Royal Palace was the safest place on the Norland continent. No matter how powerful Alex was, he couldn't force his way into the palace. Even though there were over 20 10th tier powerhouses in the Rodu Empire present, they weren't confident that they could capture Alex and Irina outside the palace. His Majesty has decreed that Alex and Irina are to enter the palace. Not long after, a drawn-out voice sounded from the palace. Open the city gate, Dominic ordered. The palace gate opened slowly, and the guards standing in front of the gate also parted to the sides. The purple-striped griffin landed. Meg and Irina jumped off the griffin, and walked into the palace. Dominic led a few 10th tier powerhouses down from the city tower, and welcomed Meg and Irina. Follow me, Dominic said, and led the 2 of them into the depths of the palace. 6 10th tier powerhouses followed behind them, and kept their guard up against the 2 of them. Meg didn't say a word, either. Only Andre could make this decision. In order to avoid unnecessary panic, it was better for as few people as possible to know about this. The group of people walked through the long corridor of the palace, and finally stopped outside a huge hall. General Dominic, Alex, and Irina, please enter the hall, the official at the door said loudly. Dominic led the way into the hall. Meg and Irina exchanged a look and followed him into the hall. This was a meeting hall where Andre and his subordinates discussed matters. Alex used to be a frequent visitor here. Meg and the rest visited in the middle of the night, and the hall was brightly lit, but only Andre was sitting on the main seat. However, the moment Meg entered the hall, he was locked on by a few powerhouses. Meg glanced at the shadow behind Andre, and frowned, but quickly regained his composure. Dominic sat down on Andre's left. Alex, Irina, please take a seat. Andre smiled and raised his hand. Meg and Andre sat down in the last row. Why are the two of you here in the middle of the night? Andre asked Meg. This is what we experienced in the Roth Empire's extreme north snow plains today. Your Majesty can take a look first. Meg took out an image recording stone. Andre raised his hand, and a servant at the side quickly took the image recording stone from Meg and quickly played it on the equipment in the meeting hall. This was the video that Meg let the system record during the battle. It included the disappearing ancient corpses in the underground cavern, the battle between him and Rankster, and the scene of Cthulhu crawling out from under the ice and commanding countless ancient corpses to attack them. Andre's and Dominic's expressions changed drastically when they saw this. Dominic even stood up from his chair. What is this? Andre's voice was trembling. Although it was just an image recording, the gelatinous thing covered in scales still gave him a huge impact. He even felt fear from the depths of his soul. This is Cthulhu, a devil from hell. It broke free from the seal under the Golden Dragon Island, and is an unkillable monster, Meg introduced calmly. It controlled those ancient corpses? And made them fight for it? Dominic asked Meg. Yes. It used some method to control these ancient corpses, and let them retain 50 to 60% of their abilities when they were alive. Also, they can be fearless and carry out orders resolutely. Meg nodded. Dominic's expression was grave. As the Empire's marshal, he knew very well what such an undead army meant. Even the Empire's most elite Northwestern cavalry couldn't guarantee that every soldier could be fearless and carry out orders resolutely. They're going south? Andre had already regained his composure, and asked Meg. I don't think it resurrected them just to hold an undead party on the ice plains, Meg said with a smile. Andre, it seems like your previous judgment was right. The seal under the Golden Dragon Island has something to do with Rankster. He has already sold his soul to the devil, Dominic said in a low voice with a tinge of regret. Heroes appreciated each other. As one of the few people with the most unyielding fighting style in this world, Dominic had a good impression of Rankster. However, from the previous images, Rankster had indeed lost himself and become the devil's puppet. Rankster still has a trace of consciousness. He hasn't been completely controlled, Meg retorted, but he didn't mention Elizabeth. If the devil wants to bring the undead army south, what are your plans? Andre asked Meg with a deep gaze. If the devil and the undead army come south, the Roth Empire will be the first to bear the brunt of it. There's no way to avoid it. Meg looked at Andre. I'm here to inform you to be prepared for battle lest you get caught off guard. Andre stared at Meg for a while, but he didn't say anything else. You want the Roth Empire to resist the devil and the undead army alone? Andre asked with a frown. If we can't, the Roth Empire will definitely be the first to be destroyed. Meg nodded. Dominic was silent. From the far North Highlands all the way south, it became flatter after entering the Roth Empire. If the devil and his undead army wanted to go south, the only choice was to start from the Roth Empire. The Roth Empire had no choice at all. Andre's face darkened, and he said, what about after the Roth Empire is destroyed? Will the other races be spared? Meg looked at him calmly, and said, actually, this is not something I should consider. Even if I'm willing to form an alliance with the other races to deal with the devil and the undead army, the final decision will still be made by you people in power. You should know better than anyone that this concerns the fate of the entire Norland continent, Andre said as he looked into Meg's eyes. Meg asked, if there's no peace agreement, do you think the other races will send troops to help the Roth Empire stop the devil and the undead army? Are you threatening me? No, I'm just telling you that there's no use threatening me at this time. Meg pointed at the image of Cthulhu on the screen. If you think the Roth Empire can deal with this fellow, this world is yours. Andre stared at Meg in silence. He kept quiet. Meg looked at him calmly, and didn't say anything else. Dominic broke the silence, and stood up to tell Andre, Your Majesty, we need the help of the other races. As the Marshal of the Empire and the commander of the three armies, he had to clearly inform His Majesty what kind of predicament and enemy the Empire was facing. Chapter 2095. When Meg and Irina left the palace, they received a promise from Andrei. The Roth Empire was willing to join the peace alliance and sign a new peace agreement. As a condition, the various races in the peace alliance had to send out a huge allied army to stop the Devils and the Undead army from going south together with the Roth Empire. Where are we going now? Irina asked Meg. You go home first. I'm worried about leaving the two children at home. I have to make a trip back to Chaos City and talk to Michael personally, Meg said. All right. Be careful on the way back. Irina nodded and used the teleportation portal to return to the tavern. The purple-striped griffin soared into the sky and flew out of the city towards the south. What are the chances of the Roth Empire winning against the undead army with our military strength? Andrei asked Dominic in the hall. 50%, Dominic replied. Then why not fight? Although we have a 50% chance of winning, even if we win in the end, Your Majesty won't have any more troops to use, Dominic said seriously. The undead are different from living creatures. They have no fear. They only want to be killed. They don't have the concept of surrender or failure. The icy plains of the extreme north are ancient battlefields with countless corpses buried there. If that devil really controls them, we might have to face a terrifying army. Your Majesty, we can still fight the undead army, but we can't deal with that devil alone. That day at the sealed land in Chaos City, I saw with my own eyes how scary that thing is. It's definitely not something that 10th-tier powerhouses can kill and deal with together. Andrei was silent for a long time before he finally sighed deeply. The image recording stones that were sent to the dragons were immediately delivered to Douglas and Lewis, who were still in Rodu. The two of them looked at each other after watching the photo stone in the secret chamber. They saw the shock in each other's eyes. How trustworthy is it? You think Alex has a need to lie to us? The two of them were silent for a while. Rankster is indeed controlled by the devil, and his power has increased to a certain extent. He can fight Alex on equal footing, Douglas said with a complicated expression. Lewis's expression was also very solemn, and he said in a deep voice, a devil that has broken free from the restrictions of the seal is the most troublesome. And now, it's controlling a huge number of ancient corpses. This is a calamity that can engulf the entire Norland continent. Even the giant dragons won't be able to escape unscathed. Douglas looked at the final image of the terrifying, indescribable object with a heavy heart. Now, we can only wait for the results of Alex and Andrei's negotiation. If he can convince Andrei to join the peace alliance and sign the peace agreement, all races will be able to work together to get rid of the devils and the undead army, Lewis said with a slight nod. What is this? She, who had just finished writing her diary and made a report, found a small brown cup in the corner of the cabin. The small cup looked ordinary, and its craftsmanship was not high quality. It was even a little rough. It should have been left behind by Meg and the others. She picked it up and shook it gently. There was the sound of soup sloshing inside. After hesitating for a moment, she opened the lid of the small cup. A rich fragrance wafted out of the small cup and quickly filled the cabin. It smells so good. She's eyes lit up as she looked at the small cup in her hand in disbelief. It was a cup of soup. There were various ingredients floating in the brown soup. Although the soup was already cold, it still emitted an irresistible aroma. It was even more tempting than the cold mixed pig tongue and cold mixed pig ears that she had the other day. Is this food that they accidentally left behind? She gulped. Mark, unknown food number 1. As an observer, she had the responsibility to investigate all unknown things on the Norland continent, including food. According to human eating habits, food will be heated to kill germs and give the food a better texture and fragrance. She put the small cup into the heating device and set a heating time. Ding! The heating was complete. She opened the small table and took out the heated cup. She turned on the camera and aimed it at herself and the small cup on the small table. Then, she reached out and opened the lid of the small cup. Steam rose up, and the aroma bloomed. She's eyes widened as she looked at the small cup in front of her in disbelief. This aroma was too special and impactful. I can smell its fragrance. There should be some kind of fungus, seafood, and meat in it. It's hard to describe this kind of fragrance with a general concept. They have distinct layers, but they are perfectly and harmoniously blended together. It's a very wonderful and tempting fragrance. What's strange is that I smell wine in it. They actually used wine to cook food. She explained to the camera. She didn't expect herself to use so many adjectives and talk so much. This was a little inconsistent with her usual style. However, in order to recreate the authenticity of this food as accurately as possible, she could only describe it this way. She zoomed in. I can see that there are many ingredients in this cup of soup. Meat, shellfish, mushrooms, and many other ingredients that I don't recognize. But the amazing thing is that although the soup is brown, it's very clear and doesn't feel turbid or greasy at all. The state of the ingredients is just right. There are so many different ingredients, but they can be so precise. This chef must have very strong control. She zoomed out and then scooped up a spoonful of soup with a spoon. After waiting for a while, she put it into her mouth. The delicious soup slowly soaked into her taste buds. She felt like her taste buds were moistened by a fine spring rain and gradually woke up. The soothing feeling was wonderful. The savory taste of the various ingredients was fully displayed in this mouthful of meaty broth, blooming on her taste buds. Even with her supersensory ability, her brain could not accurately distinguish each taste in a short period of time. She closed her eyes and seemed to see mushrooms that had just emerged from the needles, shellfish that crawled slowly on the bottom of the sea, and pheasants that walked through the grass, fresh. It was fresh, and delicious. The strong aroma of the wine seeped into the soup, making it even more intoxicating. She opened her eyes and looked at the camera in silence for a while before quietly drinking another mouthful of soup. It's hard to describe the taste of this soup with words. It's so delicious and fresh. Among the food I've tasted, nothing can compare to it. She looked at the camera and said, "Next, let's try the ingredients in this soup." She scooped up a piece of shark's fin with a spoon. Just as she put it to her mouth, it slid into her mouth with a slurp. The shark's fin that was soaked in soup had a very wonderful texture and a wonderful taste. It rippled in her mouth before she swallowed it. Next was the chicken. The chicken looked small and stiff. When she bit into it, it did not have the expected texture of rotten meat. Instead, it had the perfect amount of tenderness and softness. Moreover, it did not only have the taste of chicken. The aroma of wine, seafood, mushrooms, and various meats had been blended together perfectly. There was flavor within flavor. When chewed, it was soft but not rotten. The aftertaste was endless. Sorry, I seem to have forgotten to explain the process. She looked at the empty small cup in front of her and was silent for a long time. This recording ends here. Unknown food number 1, incomplete. She turned off the camera and stared at the small cup for a long time. What kind of food is this? She couldn't control her curiosity. As a professionally trained observer, this was an emotion that should not appear. Chapter 2096. Michael was Meg's favorite leader. Their similar ideals and judgments always allowed them to reach a consensus very quickly. This is an event that will definitely be recorded in history. "You have started a new era of peace," Michael lamented as he looked at the letter of commitment in his hands. This is only a letter of commitment. It can only be considered as the first glimpse of dawn. Meg shook his head with a smile. "Next, I don't have to go to all the races one by one, right? The content in this photo stone is enough for all the races to deeply consider the current situation. The Roth Empire joining the Peace Alliance also means that the War Alliance has lost its backbone, and is no longer a cause for concern." Michael shook his head and put down the letter of commitment in his hands. He looked at Meg and said, "Alex, the residents of the Norland continent should thank you. If the demons still have hope of winning the war, tell them that the first step before the Allied army goes up north to snipe the undead army is to get rid of all the unstable factors at the rear," Meg said with a smile. Michael also smiled when he heard that. "In order to deal with those ancient corpses, I have recently researched a large-scale killing weapon. However, I need Chaos City support to mass-produce it." Meg took out a stack of blueprints. "This is a bomb." Meg then went to the textile factory to meet Ashley. As Irina's trusted general, Ashley was one of the few people who knew his identity. "The situation in the north is a little urgent. I hope the textile factory can suspend all the businesses on hand and rush out this batch of cannons." Meg handed a stack of blueprints to Ashley. Ashley took the blueprints and asked Meg, "Is this Her Highness' order?" Meg nodded with a smile. "Her order should be delivered tomorrow." Ashley nodded slightly before flipping through the blueprints. After a while, she looked at Meg and said, "Elves are not good at forging. If the situation is urgent, it might be more efficient to hand it over to the dwarven blacksmiths. This thing is a little special. I don't want others to have it for the time being. I only trust the night elves." Meg shook his head and seriously said, "I need you to use all your production capacity to produce cannons. This might be able to reduce our casualties on the battlefield." "All right." Ashley nodded solemnly. Meg only left Chaos City after he confirmed some problems with the craftsmanship with Ashley, and told her to look for him if she had any questions. "Host, your actions have already affected the normal development of the Norland continent. It might trigger a series of upheavals and attract the attention and punishment of the Heavenly Tao. The system's voice sounded. System, this is a world with an advanced civilization. They already operate interstellar battleships and use electromagnetic cannons. It shouldn't be too much for me to make a cannon, right? Furthermore, I only created the cannons to maintain the stability of this world. Isn't it too much to say that I've caused unrest? Meg curled his lips. She's performance on the ice field today had brought him great shock and inspiration. An interstellar battleship at full power could easily wipe out tens of thousands of ancient corpses. If the Roth Empire's knights were sent to the front line, they would be risking their lives. The electromagnetic cannon was too ridiculous, and Meg did not have the ability to build one. However, cannons were different. Meg had made some simple improvements to the red coat cannons of the Ming dynasty. Not only did they have powerful destructive power, but they would also not appear to be too radical and attract the attention of the ancients. The zombie army did not have any psychological weaknesses. Under Cthulhu's control, they could charge forward fearlessly. However, after being buried in the ice for countless years, the corpses were not as hard as imagined. Even if it was the allied forces of various races, the number of magic casters was limited. Every cannon could be seen as a magic caster who could release fireballs. If they could build a considerable number of cannons before the war, they would definitely play an important role in the war. Meg's idea was very simple. He wanted to kill more undead armies and let fewer allied forces die. Of course, he also wanted to avoid attracting the attention of the ancients because of the rapid development of technology. He did not want to be dissected for research now. He actually ran away. Interesting, in an ice cave, Josh was sitting on an ice throne as he looked down at Rankster with a smile. Rankster was silent. Since they ran away, it means that it's time for us to go south. We have been quiet for too long, and many people might have forgotten about our existence. Josh said with a cold smile as he rubbed the handle gently. Rankster nodded and turned to leave the ice cave. Alex. His resentment is really not small. Don't worry, I will help you catch him and make him suffer a fate worse than death. A low voice echoed in the ice cave. The photo stones that were sent to the various races caused a huge commotion. The demons outside Chaos City that had yet to break the seal had already shown the various races how terrifying the Great Old Ones were. This demon that had broken free from the seal and gathered a terrifying number of ancient corpses was even more terrifying. The various races had already sent their representatives to Chaos City. This was an event that could affect the fate of all the races on the Norland continent. Even the demons who were isolated on the island did not think they would be spared. Before returning to Rodu, Meg made a trip to the staff dormitory. Elizabeth had not returned. Meg sighed. He wondered how she would feel if she knew about Rankster's current situation. Taking advantage of the night, the purple-striped griffin rose into the sky again and flew towards the north. Meg only returned to the tavern in Rodu when it was close to daybreak, and made breakfast while he was at it. I went to the textile factory yesterday and got the night elves to help me make a batch of weapons. Ashley needs your authorization, Meg said as he scooped porridge for Irina. I will send her a letter later. Irina nodded and took the porridge from Meg. What did Michael say? His philosophy has always been close to ours. We will leave the Peace Alliance and the New Resistance Alliance to him. He is more professional than us. The two children were still asleep. Meg scooped a bowl of porridge for himself and sat down opposite Irina. If the demons and Oster still want to cause trouble, we will deal with them first and sign the peace treaty before heading north. That's pretty good. We have solved all the problems in one go. Irina nodded slightly. We are still not sure what position the Ancient Ones have. If they can participate in the war, no matter how many ancient corpses there are, they will only be cannon fodder. Even if there is only one battleship, its lethality will be greater than many 10th-tier powerhouses. Meg frowned. What we should be worried about now is Cthulhu and Josh. As long as we get rid of them, the undead army will collapse on its own. Irina shook her head slightly. Meg nodded. I will take a nap later. After that, we will set off to the north to find a suitable place to set up the sealing spell formation. Ding! A crisp sound of a notification. Ai Fei, who was in a daze, collected his thoughts. He was stunned for a moment before he remembered to close the furnace's inlet and turn off the fire. The Titan Tavern, after the new equipment, of the new batch of Titan Tavern. Effie's expression, the pressure of the air pressure valve decreased until the air pressure was completely balanced. Only then did Effie take a cup and connect it to the bottom of the wine reservoir and turn the switch. Clear and transparent wine gushed out from the wine spout, along with a slightly stimulating wine aroma. It's done. Effie's face lit up with joy. This wine fragrance was exactly the same as the one she had smelled when her father brewed wine in the brewery. It was also the fragrance that she had been searching for and trying to create in the past 10 years, but to no avail. She didn't expect Mr. Hades to change her brewing equipment and streamline a few processes, allowing her to successfully brew pure Titan Tavern. It's done. Miss succeeded. Mara, who had just walked into the brewery, was also pleasantly surprised. It's only half done. Titan Tavern doesn't have a soul unless it's stored for at least 2 years. Effie shook her head with a smile and said, Mara, go get the oak barrels. I need to first mix these raw wines into qualified Titan Tavern, and then put them into barrels to seal. Okay. Mara immediately replied. When Effie put the first batch of Titan Tavern into the oak barrels and closed the lid, it was already 3 in the afternoon. Miss, this is too heavy. We can't move it with just the 2 of us. Mara patted the oak barrels that were about the same height as her. This was a huge barrel that could hold 300 bottles. Let's leave it here first. We'll get someone to help move it to the cellar tomorrow. Effie wiped the sweat off her forehead with a silk handkerchief, and looked at her sweat-soaked clothes with disdain as she said, I'm going to take a shower and change my clothes first, then rest for a while. We still have to open for business at night. I'll go boil some water for you, Mara replied. The Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern stood everyone up on their first day of winning the Double Gold Award. This had already become a topic of ridicule among the customers of Rodu for the entire day. However, it was precisely because they didn't get to drink water that they were shrouded in a veil of mystery, which made them even more curious. News about the Saipan Tavern had also started to spread. Among them was the news that Duke Abraham and Princess Vanessa were regulars of this tavern, and that the owner of the tavern was rather mysterious, which also spread like wildfire. While everyone was curious about the Moutai wine, they also reminded themselves to be careful in the Saipan Tavern. The sky wasn't dark yet, but there were already customers loitering in front of the 2 taverns. However, the doors of the 2 taverns were still tightly shut as if they had already discussed it beforehand. It didn't look like they were going to open for business, which made the customers who came early feel a little disgruntled. Effie looked at the 8 waiters of the Titan Tavern with a serious expression, and said, Today is the first day of the Titan Tavern's reopening, and also the first day of our upgrade to a high-end tavern. Be on your guard, and don't make any mistakes. Yes. Everyone agreed one after another. At the same time, in the Saipan Tavern on the other side. Meg looked at the increasing number of customers outside, and frowned slightly as he complained, Looks like it's time for our tavern to hire employees. Otherwise, we won't be able to serve enough customers. When we leave in the future, we'll have to find someone to run the tavern. Do you need me to arrange a few night elves for you? Irina asked. No, this is Rodu. They have to be humans. Meg shook his head. Not every elf could disguise themselves like them. It would obviously be easier to find employees in Rodu. Irina put down her bowl, wiped her lips elegantly, and said with a smile, I'm going to make a trip to the Wind Forest tonight. I'll leave this place to you. Mag looked at the crowded customers outside, and could already imagine the chaos that would ensue on this night. Chapter 2098. So, which tavern are we going to choose tonight? Kurt asked with a smile as he stood in the middle of the road and looked at the Titan Tavern on his left and the Saipan Tavern on his right. Only children make choices. I'll take both. Fergus shook his head with a smile. Then, which tavern shall we start with? Of course it's the Saipan Tavern. I only drank a little that day, and haven't tasted it yet. I've been thinking about it for the past 2 days. Fergus walked toward the Saipan Tavern without hesitation. That is indeed the case. Kurt followed with a smile. The Saipan Tavern today was more lively than usual. This was a little unfriendly to the regulars who were already used to drinking at the Saipan Tavern. However, after hearing that the Moutai wine had won the gold medal at the wine tasting conference, everyone still felt a little proud when they saw the shiny trophy on the wine cabinet. The style of this tavern is a little retro. Kurt walked into the tavern and scanned the surroundings. There were no dazzling decorations or lights. The tavern was mainly made of simple wood and dark colors, making it feel warm and comfortable. They weren't late, but there were only 2 empty tables left. Go and take a seat over there. I'll go and order some wine so that there won't be any seats later, Kurt said to Fergus. Sure. Fergus nodded with a smile. Speaking of which, it had been many years since he went to reserve a seat because he was worried that there wouldn't be enough seats. Kurt came to the bar counter and looked up at the wine list on the wall. Mount I wine, 2,000 copper coins per bottle. It was surprisingly cheap. There was no lack of expensive wine in Rodu, but none of them could be compared to Mount I wine in terms of quality. The price of 2,000 copper coins per bottle was definitely a kind boss. Whiskey, 2,000 copper coins per bottle. What wine is this? Kurt was instantly interested. Since it could be sold at the same price as Mount I wine, could it be that the quality was similar? Kurt looked around, but couldn't find a waiter who could order. What would you like to order? A soft and cute voice sounded. Kurt took 2 steps forward before noticing the little girl sitting behind the counter. The little girl was small, but she was really cute. Kurt revealed a kind smile, and said, "I'd like a bottle of Mount I wine and a bottle of whiskey, and all the dishes to go with the wine." "All right." Amy nodded and quickly said, "It's a total of 4,120 copper coins. Because the shop is too busy, we paid the bill in advance." Kurt, who was about to return to his seat, stopped in his tracks when he heard that. Looking at the huge tavern, only the boss was busy in the kitchen and a young lady was serving dishes. He was indeed very busy. "What if we don't have enough to drink later?" Kurt joked as he dug into his purse. "What you should be thinking about is how you're going to get drunk later," Amy said with a smile. Kurt was taken aback for a moment before he smiled confidently. He had been in the wine industry for decades and had drunk all kinds of strong and fine wines, but he had never been knocked out by a single bottle. "All right, I want to see if this wine is really that strong." Kurt paid the bill and returned to his seat with a smile. "Why are you so happy?" Fergus asked with a smile. "This boss's daughter is really interesting. I ordered 2 bottles of wine and she was worried that we would get drunk." Kurt laughed. "Only 2 bottles? Little girl, you haven't seen us when we were young, drinking 10 bottles each." Fergus laughed as well. "I saw that this tavern not only has Mautai, but also a type of wine called whiskey. It's the same as Mautai, both are 2,000 copper coins a bottle, so I ordered a bottle of each. I'll try it later before ordering." "Whiskey?" Fergus said with a bit of surprise. "To be able to sell it at the same price as Mautai, it means that this wine is on the same level as Mautai in the boss's heart. Interesting. Then I want to see if this young boss can really make 2 good wines on the same level as Mautai," Kurt said with a smile. The two waited for a while before Meg walked over with 2 bottles of wine and 3 dishes. Meg wasn't surprised to see Kurt and Fergus, because he had already seen many of the faces he had seen at the wine tasting conference. "I didn't expect the 2 of you to come too." Meg put down the dishes and said with a smile. "I only drank a few mouthfuls that day and wasn't satisfied. Of course I'll come again." Kurt looked at the 2 bottles of wine on the table and asked with some curiosity, "Mr. Hades has 2 wines, why is he only sending Mautai to the wine tasting conference? I heard that the wine tasting conference only has 1 gold medal." Meg nodded slightly and then turned to walk towards the kitchen. Kurt and Fergus paused slightly and only came back to their senses when Meg turned around. "I haven't seen this kind of confidence in a young man for many years." Kurt looked at Meg's back. "I want to see what kind of whiskey he's worried about not having enough gold medals to get." Fergus took the bottle of whiskey, pulled out the stopper, and poured it into 2 glasses. The aroma of the wine wafted out, carrying with it a faint burnt smell and a strong smoky smell. The 2 picked up their glasses and furrowed their brows at the same time. "Is this a failure?" Fergus looked at the brownish-yellow wine with hints of red in the glasses. He had only smelled the smoky smell in some very failed wines, and that was a serious mistake in the drying process. This made his impression of Meg drop a little. A qualified winemaker wouldn't let a failure appear in front of the guests. Unless he wanted to rely on the success of Mautai to play a little trick in front of the guests. Kurt's original thoughts were similar to Fergus, but just as he was about to put down the glass, he suddenly felt something was wrong. He moved the glass closer and used his left hand to fan the mouth of the glass lightly to concentrate the aroma of the wine. "It's not a failure. This is its unique aroma." Kurt's eyes lit up as he looked at Fergus with some surprise. "Aroma? Yes. Smell it carefully again. This smoky smell isn't disgusting. On the contrary, after the initial discomfort, you'll find it even more fascinating. And after you get used to the smoky smell, you'll discover other aromas hidden within. Yes. It's the aroma of malt." Kurt was as surprised as a child who had discovered a huge secret. Fergus doubtfully picked up the wine glass again and imitated Kurt's actions to sniff the aroma of the wine. After a while, his eyes widened, and his expression became a little incredulous. "Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's try it first. Kurt picked up the glass and slowly took a sip, using the tip of his tongue to swirl it around in his mouth. When the aroma of the whiskey filled his entire mouth, he carefully savored the different aroma in different parts of his mouth before swallowing. The taste was dry, mellow, round, and soft. The faint smoky taste brought about an intoxicating texture. Good wine. Kurt put down the glass and nodded solemnly at Fergus. End of chapter. Chapter 2099. Shock. That was the most profound feeling Kurt and Fergus had after tasting the whiskey. This wine smelled like a failed product at first, but under the charred and smoky aroma, there was a shocking and mesmerizing taste. He was like a wild man with a rough appearance, but he was shockingly knowledgeable. He spoke tirelessly, and people couldn't help but be intoxicated by his words. After a long while, the two of them put down their empty wine glasses at the same time. Fergus looked at Kurt and asked, "If this is a wine presented at the wine tasting conference, how many points would you give it?" 10 points without a doubt, Kurt said matter-of-factly. Fergus smiled, and said, "We should be glad that Mr. Hades brought Moutai. Otherwise, it wouldn't look good if we slapped our own faces on stage." Kurt couldn't help but praise, "The younger generation will surpass us in time. There's really a genius winemaker in our Rodu. Not only is the wine brewed well, even the dishes are so delicious." Fergus swallowed the pig's ear salad in his mouth, and grabbed a few peanuts to throw into his mouth. The two of them were completely convinced by Meg. He wasn't arrogant, but he had the ability to match it. The two of them ate delicious dishes and drank fine wine. Not long after, a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of Moutai were emptied into their stomachs. Kurt supported himself with one hand on the table, and squinted as he asked, Do we want 2 more bottles?" "Come. Cheers." Fergus answered vaguely from under the table. Meg went out and called the 2 coachmen and servants in, and directly carried them away. "See, I told you they didn't need another bottle." Amy rested her chin on her hands, and said with a smile as she watched the two of them being carried away. In this world, Moutai and whiskey with 40 to 50% alcohol content were definitely strong liquors. Those who boasted that they wouldn't get drunk after 1,000 cups were all drinking fruit wine with almost zero alcohol content. As long as the urinary system could keep up, it wasn't strange at all to not get drunk after 1,000 cups. There were many new customers in the Saipan Tavern today, and they quickly got drunk as they hadn't experienced high alcohol tolerance. Luckily, those who could afford 2,000 copper coins a bottle of wine would bring their coachmen and servants with them when they went out, and this saved Meg a lot of trouble. The Saipan Tavern was harmonious. The situation at the Titan Tavern was not good. The reopened Titan Tavern had updated its wine list. The only wine they were selling now was the 30-year-old Titan wine, which cost 3,000 copper coins per bottle. The Titan wine, which was originally sold at a low price but in large quantities, had disappeared along with some of the low-priced wines that were sold on behalf of other breweries. "Yes, your mother's radish sticks and your father's wine are the most unforgettable memories for me." Pasak nodded with emotion. "I heard that at the wine tasting conference yesterday, you took out the Titan wine that your father had stored in the cellar for 30 years, and you were able to supply a certain amount every day, so I came to take a look today." "Yes, please come in. There are about 10 bottles left today," Aife said with a smile. "Then you must leave me a bottle." Pasak's eyes lit up and he followed her in. Seeing that the seat at the door was just empty, he sat down. After a while, Aife came in with a bottle of wine and a plate of radish sticks, and she placed the wine and dishes in front of Pasak. "Although my wine is not as good as my father's, I learned how to make radish sticks from my mother." Aife smiled. Pasak picked up his chopsticks and picked up a piece of golden radish stick, and took a bite. Catch of the crisp texture, the slightly salty and sweet taste made Pasak's eyebrows raise, and he revealed a happy smile. "I always thought that you were like your mother, even the skill of making radish sticks has been passed down. It's very delicious, and it's the same taste as before." Pasak put down his chopsticks and gave Aife a thumbs up. "Thank you, please enjoy." Aife turned and left with a smile on her face. Yes, guests always came and went like this, and only the taste could make a guest become sentimental. Even if more than 10 years had passed, just hearing the news, people would still want to come and take a look, to find the taste in their memories. Aife suddenly knew what she was going to do. Let those guests who came in high spirits go back home. This was what she should do. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.